Great. So, all right. Well, thank you all for being here with us. So our panel, our workshop is entitled Race and Archaeology, a Multipronged Approach. My name is Vanessa Davies. I am an Egyptologist. I work on the early 20th century on the contributions of scholars of African descent in the US to Egyptology and Nubiology. I will quickly introduce our panelists. I'm going to present a few key points about our workshop, and then I'm going to turn it over to the panelists to give you more information about their work. And the bulk of the time today after that will be devoted to Q&A, which will happen in the chat. So first, our panelists. Kevin Burrell is an Old Testament and religious studies scholar who has recently published a reassessment of Kushite ethnographic representations in biblical literature. Deborah Hurd is an archaeologist, Egyptologist, and Nubiologist whose research focuses on the text and iconography of Kushite temples in Upper Nubia. Shamarka Keita is a biological anthropologist and medical doctor. His publications have examined aspects of the skeletal biology of the pre-dynastic and early dynastic periods, the concept of race, and the history of ideas about biological relationships of the early Nile Valley. And finally, Stuart Tyson Smith is an archaeologist, Egyptologist, and Nubiologist who has led excavations at Tombos in modern Sudan since 2000, and has written a book on ethnic identities in Nubia. So we have a little over 80 participants right now. For those of you joining us in the audience, please put your questions in the chat as they occur to you. I will be keeping track of the chat and I will pose your questions to the panelists. So each of us in this workshop approaches the study of ancient Nile Valley cultures from different perspectives. To begin this discussion, I will share a few key points on which we all agree and which inform our research. And then I'm going to hand it over to the panelists who will more fully introduce you to their work. So there are 5 points I'll share with you. The first is that the ancient Nile Valley cultures are indisputably African cultures. There was no dividing line or border between those cultures. There was a continuum of population groups living there. The ancient Nile Valley cultures were not removed from one another. On the contrary, they were very much entangled with one another. There was no massive replacement of the population of the Nile Valley with another population group, either in antiquity or later. And finally, the ancient Nile Valley cultures did not have a conception of race or human variation that can be equated to a modern Western conception. Our panel is on race and archaeology. We acknowledge that in the modern world, race exists as a cultural construct and racism exists as a social reality. Race is not a biological reality. And the ancient Nile Valley cultures did not have either a racial theory of biological variation or sociocultural constructions of racial identity. So now I'm going to ask each panelist to speak for about 5 minutes each on how their work intersects with the ideas of race and variation. I will hand it over first to Kevin, then Deborah, then Shamarka, and then Stuart. Kevin, take it away.
All right, thank you very much, Vanessa. I am honored to be here with my distinguished colleagues, and I'm truly privileged to be part of this panel. And I just want to say welcome to everyone. I'm sort of the outlier here, I suppose, because I do not study the Nile Valley directly, but rather indirectly, in the sense that my main emphasis is biblical research. But I draw heavily on Nile Valley studies in order to inform my research on Kushites in the Hebrew Bible. And there's clearly an intersection between biblical studies and Egyptology historically, where each field has informed in some way or the other, the other. Biblical studies has depended on Egyptology to inform interpretations of biblical texts, and conversely, in important ways, Egyptology has also depended on biblical studies to inform its own understanding of the past. So there's been cross-fertilization between these fields of inquiry. I'm particularly interested in the Nile Valley because biblical studies, like virtually all disciplines in the Western intellectual tradition that matured in the 19th century, has obscured the presence of Africans in the biblical text in the biblical world. Many scholars have pointed out both past and present efforts to suppress the African presence or to diminish the role of Africans, or simply to ignore the African contribution to biblical history. Martin Bernal has maintained that the academic production of knowledge is an element of Western imperialism, and this assessment, in my view, is fundamentally true for the academic interpretation of the Bible. It was very common, and still is to some degree, where any African, insofar as they were acknowledged, were cast as servile outsiders in biblical interpretation. The trope of the servile African was very much, and still to some degree, characteristic of biblical interpretations involving people of African descent. This, of course, was true for a number of disciplines, including those disciplines concerned with the study of Nile Valley civilizations. So the field of biblical studies had essentially accepted uncritically many of the interpretations coming out of Egyptology, and therefore, not surprisingly, reflected much of these biases inherent in an earlier generation of Egyptological studies. Fortunately, there has also been much development in the field of Egyptology, particularly in Nubian studies, which has come into its own in recent years. Over the last few decades, a new group of scholars, some of whom are sitting on this very panel today, have refashioned the relationship between ancient Egypt and Kush, and are contributing to the dismantling of some of these previous racialist interpretations, some of these previously slanted, biased assumptions about Kush and Nubia and sub-Saharan Africa. Unfortunately, there has not been an equally fruitful movement within biblical studies to redress some of these concerns, and so old ideas still prevail in this field. For example, it is still customary for Nubia to be excluded from maps of the ancient Near East, and dictionaries and commentaries on biblical peoples routinely omit discussion of Cushites. On the other hand, and commendably, a number of biblical scholars, many of African descent, whether Africans or African Americans, among others, have over the years been attempting to address some of these issues in biblical studies. And I personally owe a debt of gratitude for their work that they've been doing to pave the way for my own research on Cushites in the biblical world. I've attempted to build on what they have done by engaging substantively with Nile Valley studies, more so than has been previously undertaken, especially incorporating more recent developments in Nubian studies in my own research. I've been especially interested in understanding the dynamics of ethnic interaction in the Nile Valley. And similarly, I've been keenly interested in the history of Kush and the political relationship between Kush and Egypt. I draw extensively on the work of scholars who study the ancient Nile Valley, again, several of whom are sitting here, in order to provide comparative context for my study of Cushites in the Hebrew Bible. And here's what I've concluded in accordance with what Vanessa stated in her introductory remarks. Ancient peoples, Egyptians, Assyrians, Israelites, among others, did not develop a concept of collective difference akin to modern ideas about race, rooted as such concepts are in essentialized biology and attended by systemic denigration of specific groups of people based on somatic features like skin color. Clearly, ancient peoples, including Israelites, did differentiate between themselves and others, often in very uncharitable and chauvinistic ways, but yet developed no systemic view of racial identity as in the modern period. The Hebrew Bible, for example, does not betray any systemic concern for ethnicity as such, much less race, but rather concerned itself with ethnicity only insofar as ethnic identity intersected with its greater concern of religious identity. The Hebrew Bible exhibits a kind of ethnocentrism rooted in a religious chauvinism, namely the idea of election. And election entailed two fundamental premises. First of all, the assumption of a monotheistic, absolute sovereign deity who was the creator of all mankind. And secondly, that this deity had chosen Israel and only Israel to be his special people. That's what made Israel separate and distinct from other groups, was not something innate, rather the fact that they had a special, unique, and exclusive relationship with the sovereign deity. Consequently, this monotheistic worldview implicated the polytheism of other groups. And yet, the universal theology of the Hebrew Bible militates against the kind of biological, essentialist concept of identity that developed in the modern West. From the perspective of the Hebrew Bible, all human beings had a common origin, created in the image of God and descended from the same parent group. Hence, it is not racial biology that separates Israel from the other, but moral or religious choice. Therefore, collective difference was conceived of primarily on moral theological grounds. One may speak thus of an ethno-religious identity when it comes to the Hebrew Bible's view of collective identity. Finally, in the Hebrew Bible, Cushites, like other people groups, are depicted in both positive and negative ways in service of this doctrine of Israelite election. And while somatic features were noticed and even described in some instances, again, no systemic concerns are demonstrated regarding somatic features like skin color. Studying the history of the Nile Valley cultures and understanding the nature of ethnic dynamics within that environment has helped me to get a comparative picture of how biblical writers conceived of collective differences and how they too deployed ethno-religious stereotypes towards various ends. So, thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. So now Deborah.
Thank you, Vanessa and Kevin. The way that I approach this topic is through archaeology, specifically through going through Nubia. My research for my dissertation focuses on the Kushite period in Nubia. And I chose that specifically because there are texts. So my engagement looks at both inscriptions and textual material as well as archaeological material. So I'm combining the two to look at particular Kushite cultural, social, political phenomena. But race does not play a part of that, you know. So my engagement with race has come through actually analyzing the archaeological reports that I've been using for my dissertation and just learning about Nubia just in general, because when I first came to learn about Nubia was through taking a class in Middle Egyptian. And there are no classes really in Nubian studies in the US. So if you decide that you want to engage in Nubian studies, you basically have to go on a pilgrimage of self-study. And that involves going through reading all of the textual materials, all the archaeological reports that have been done, you know, throughout time by Egyptologists. That's where the race comes in. Because when you start reading those archaeological reports, you see in these interpretations that there's a particular way in which Egyptologists are trying to dissociate Nubians from being Black or being African. And they explicitly say that the Nubians, though brown and curly haired, are not Negro. So there's this way that the 19th century views of race are being inserted into the archaeological record and being transported back in time to look at this material, interpret it. So as I began doing my historical background for my dissertation, that's when I really came across all of this material. And it was just shocking to me that these conversations were happening, but then you have to look at the time period, and we'll have this discussion as we move on and we talk collectively about the time, you know. But still, you see that there's almost like this intellectual acrobatics that's going on to try to say that the Nubians were a different race, that they were, you know, different from other Africans. They were different from, you know, Egyptians. The Egyptians were different from all these other people. Then the Egyptians became white. So there are all these kinds of racial acrobatics going on to make sure that the Egyptians and the Nubians were not perceived as Black or African. So those are the types of things that I've been having to kind of look at and interrogate. And I think it's important in this discussion that we acknowledge, you know, the founders of Egyptology. So Petrie and Reisner and Breasted, we're not trying to tear them down. You know, they did phenomenal work as far as archaeological excavation. We wouldn't know what we know now had it not been for them. So it's not a personal attack, but what we do have to do is interrogate the racism that's in their personal bias, the racism that comes through in Egyptological theory and interpretations, and then take that and divide that apart. You know, we have to pull that apart. We have to analyze these interpretations to remove the racist interpretation from the data so that we can look at the data and reanalyze it in views of where we are now. So that is basically how I'm approaching it. I'm also looking at how these perceptions at the beginning of Egyptology affected the practice of Egyptology and the people that participate in Egyptology. Who has the right to talk about these things? Who has the right to enter into mainstream academic discussions about these things? So those are the ways that I'm approaching, or that my work intersects with race.
Thank you for that. Moving on, Shamarka.
Yes, good afternoon, and thank you very much, Vanessa, for inviting me to this. My, if you will, interaction with the concept and notion of race, biological anthropology actually is almost primary, because the concept of race in its most developed form emanated from zoology, and even in you know, biological anthropology, natural history, what have you, you see the word used there. And also it migrated from there to social usage. And the question of what really constitutes a race has long been a problem of debate. There are some technical definitions that, in terms of zoological taxonomy, that are to be preferred. And then, of course, we have social usages. And when people say race is socially constructed, for me, the term is being used incorrectly, because it's being applied to entities that have been, in some cases, constructed politically, even legislated. And some of them, of course, don't make sense, and they don't make sense in relationship to what comes from zoology, and what exists in zoology doesn't really apply to people. So there's a circular issue there. Now, when it comes to Egyptology, African studies, African historiography, the issue gets down to the where my work intersects with that is that part of my work is that I have an interest in the history of ideas. The history of ideas and concepts about human variation, and concepts as applied to various parts of Africa, but notably the Nile Valley. And so I make distinctions about notions that sometimes are not where other people don't make distinctions. So, you know, I don't think in terms of populations, living human populations, in terms of any so-called racial identity. I think in terms of affinity, okay? Population affinity. All human beings are related, just to different degrees. All human populations are related. And some populations have very complex histories, which is something we need to discuss when we talk about the Nile Valley. You can pull DNA out of Egypt, Sudan, wherever, living West Africans, and you'll find markers or lineages that are defined because they are presumed to have arisen in Eurasia. I mean, I should say in Asia, Southwest Asia. And so then the question becomes is, what does that mean? Or what does that imply for population history? Gene history and population history are not the same things. And as a well-known group of geneticists have pointed out, you have to make a distinction between one's genes ancestors and one's own ancestors. And I'm going to read something here, but I want to illustrate that last point so that people understand it. You can have someone who phenotypically, that is to say what you see with your eyes, conforms to your expectations of this or that group. And however, they may be carrying a female lineage or Y chromosome lineage or some autosomal DNA that doesn't match your their expected group affiliation based on what you know or think you know based on their phenotype. Now, in some cases, this is due to known recent historical processes. So you can find people, let's pick African Americans or Afro-Brazilians very specifically, and they will have Y chromosome lineages that are quote unquote known to be very common in Europe. And we know the history of this. We know that these Y chromosome lineages were related to concubinage during the period of bondage, okay? And so they may have that Y chromosome lineage and look absolutely nothing like their great-great or great-grandfather. They may look totally like, quote unquote, stereotypically some member of a group. That's a very important concept and principle to understand. Why? Because when you come to the Nile Valley, you will find a population that's got variation in its DNA. And the question becomes, is this a signal of where Egyptian culture in some formed sense, or a population bearing that culture, migrated en masse into the Nile Valley? Or is that DNA a relic of Paleolithic migration when stuff was sloshing around? And by the way, when modern people left Africa, okay, and so there's a certain period of time where you may have things going back and forth. So if that's the case, then you get down to a question of, well, what makes it non-African if it's been there 20,000 years, okay? Even if it arose someplace else 30,000 years ago, no one attempts to remove the Greeks from Europe just because, the Greeks have some Y chromosome lineages that we know arose in Africa 20,000 years ago. We know that a certain percentage of the Greek population has the benign sickle cell type, sickle cell variant. So, so let's not confuse gene history with population history. And let's not confuse the fact that in places in the world where you have people where there are intersections or places are near each other, that you might have had some genes, some ancient migrants that got absorbed into the population. Let's not confuse that with the origins of culture. And let's keep in mind that Boaz was right, that we are to separate biology, biological heritage, from linguistics, language spoken, and from culture. So my interests include, as I said, the history of ideas about human variation in general, in Africa specifically. This has led me to a body of literature that includes the term race, which has been used in various ways. I note that one of the ways that we use it is the social reaction to phenotype, meaning the social reaction to what we can see with our eyes. So if you ask the question, was some Theban guy, 2000 BC, if he had whistled at some Euro-American woman in 1954 5, like Emmett Till did, could he have been lynched? The answer to that question is yes. Okay. Now, what is actual Y chromosome and mitochondrial DNA and autosome? You know, I have, we don't even have large data sets of ancient DNA to talk about that. But so for some people, that issue of phenotype is more important than the issue of a genomic background. Okay, so we have to acknowledge that when we talk to people, whether it's other archaeologists, other scientists. So this is a social use, and then there's the technical use. Now, the technical use of race, as I use it, and I was trained in a department where there were people who were some of the father figures of some recent schools of taxonomy, namely Jeff Harrison, who helped coin the terms phonetic and cladistic, et cetera, and did other work with A.J. Kane on taxonomy. The issue of what race means in a technical sense would be Darwin's usage, and Darwin basically implied that a race was an incipient species. In other words, a population so well differentiated that it could be called an incipient species. And so that would be what subspecies or race means. However, other definitions that, like geneticists recently wrote, is that a race in genetics has been defined by some as a population whose members are all more genetically similar to each other than to members of other populations. Now, that's an interesting definition, because even if you use that, the number of populations that you can find like that are probably not that great. There may be some small breeding groups in certain places that are like that. And even then, you're going to find some things that indicate that they may not all be as similar to each other as you might think that they would be, even given close, what we call endogamy. Okay. So the entities that we received historically, Mongoloid, Caucasoid, Negroid, et cetera, those aren't races in the zoological taxonomic sense, according to modern zoologists, modern thinkers. They are some vague entities that when you drill down on populations within them, you'll find all sorts of variations. Jeff Long has recently said that if you actually look at a broad spectrum of DNA from populations in, I say, infra-Saharan Africa, that you'll find that there's no unification there, that there's greater variation there than there is between those groups with each other and with than with them and populations on the outside of Africa. And then, of course, when you add other populations in Africa, you will even get a more diversified picture. So for me, to sum up, what I'd like to say is that the Nile Valley populations were African. Doesn't mean that they were, when I say that, I'm not saying that they were West Africans. I'm not saying that they were particularly any other thing. They were themselves, and I use a concept of emergence. Their biology, their culture, their language emerged in the Nile Valley or in the Saharo-Nilotic flanks in the Nile Valley. That culture and its people did not migrate. Nobody put the pyramids on their back and brought them from Asia or Greece or Norway or any place else. Okay, those ideas were hatched in an African environment by people whose biology, in a long-standing sense, had been cooked and shaped by Africa. So irrespective of some lineages that may have come in the Paleolithic, and is language, which is another topic we're not going to discuss really today, most certainly emerged in that place. So I'll just finish there, Vanessa, if that's okay.
Thank you, Shamarka. And finally, Stuart.
I would just like also to thank Vanessa for organizing this panel and for all the other participants. It should be an interesting dialogue. So because archaeologists tend to like visual things, I'm going to show some slides just because I can't resist. And also it's a very visual topic, but I'll just run through them very quickly. So obviously, if anyone has questions, we have plenty of time to return to them. And I will kind of start off where Shamarka just left it. Let me share my screen. And we'll go here. And we'll go. Let's see, do this. And this. There we go. Okay, so Shamarka left off that, this idea of Egypt developing in the context of Africa and not as a Middle Eastern civilization. And this is something that I've been exploring more intensively. I've felt this way for a long time and written a little bit about it, but I've been exploring it more intensively in my own research and dealing with Nubia in the south, which has been the main focus of my excavation. This has been readily apparent to me for a long time, but there's been a lot of resistance for this in Egyptology. And a critical part of the understanding this is that idea of the green Sahara. So we tend to view Egypt through a modern lens. We see the Nile Valley, circulating through absolute desert. But in fact, in the formative period of Egyptian civilization, Egypt was situated in this kind of larger landscape of grasslands and seasonal rains, and a widespread pastoral complex that had a set of shared symbolic resources, a lot of cultural interaction and overlap, and of course, yes, a lot of biological interaction and overlap as well. So these were very highly mobile populations that stretched over wide areas. And in fact, we really don't know exactly how far those connections might have extended, because it hasn't been possible to do a lot of archaeological work in places like Libya, Chad, and so on, Mali, even all the way across the Sahel. It would be interesting to have more archaeological work to see what was going on. What we can say is that in Northeast Africa, we do see a number of very close shared cultural elements that are widely distributed throughout the Sahara, and then also down south into Nubia, and other areas. I'll just give you one example of this, and that's ripple burnish. And on the left-hand side, you can see some sherds that we found in our work at the fourth cataract of the Nile on a salvage project, dating from, again, that kind of formative period of Egyptian civilization when there were strong interconnections throughout the region. And you can see it's a very distinctive style of pottery. It's produced by running a rocker stamp over the entire surface of the pot and then polishing over that. It's a beautiful decorative effect, as you can see from this Badari vessel from University College London, the Petrie collection at the bottom, and a very distinctive rim milling style that we also found at the fourth cataract at this more recent pot at the top. So we see a number of cultural features, especially an emphasis on cattle as well that I won't go into right now. But we can see that Egypt is interconnected at the very beginnings, but those interconnections last throughout Egyptian history. And here's a map I made up. I keep seeing in Egyptological literature people saying how Egypt was in Africa, but not African, or more engaged with the Middle East. So I decided, well, let's just map it out. And as you can see here, Egypt was heavily engaged in Northeast Africa, much more so than the Middle East, especially when you consider Egypt's long relationship, interactions, and entanglements with ancient Nubia to the south, but also through the desert and the oases. And this is where the past couple of decades, actually stretching into the early part of the 20th century, archaeological surveys and excavations in the western desert of Egypt have shown that documenting these trade routes all across the region, and have shown those interconnections, and that Egyptians really traveled widely throughout the region, as did Nubians, and that Egypt was far from being isolated in Africa, but was in fact heavily engaged and entangled with Africa. Now, to circle back to what Deborah and Kevin were saying, if I can get the next slide up. There we go. Egyptologists have tended to view Egypt through a lens of modern racism, trying to map modern racial ideas onto the ancient Egyptians. What, as Kevin pointed out, are really constructions of ethnicity, not of race, and constructions ultimately of self and other, often denigrating, but not inevitably denigrating. And so here you see the denigrating side, Tutankhamun in his chariot rolling over Nubians. So early Egyptologists saw this distinction, and other scholars as well, this distinction between Tutankhamun with lighter skin, Nubians with darker skin, and assumed this was color prejudice and some kind of existence of the concept of race in the past. You can see this already breaks down if you look to the right, and you can see a group of Tutankhamun's own soldiers that are represented with different skin colors. So the ancient Egyptians did not have a concept of blackness, did not have a concept of color prejudice and inferiority. And we can see this idea breaking down even farther when we look at private contexts of tombs. On the right-hand side and on the top, you can see the tomb of the Lower Nubian prince Jehuti-Hotep, who's representing himself in conventional Egyptian coloring. And again, color is symbolic in ancient Egypt. In some cases, we see color being used to emphasize different aspects of identity. In this case, Jehuti-Hotep is representing himself and his wife in traditional Egyptian colors of red for men, yellow for women. But we can see even in Egyptian tombs, in the tomb of Nebumun from Thebes, today in the British Museum, you can see that those color differences don't necessarily play out. And even in Jehuti-Hotep's own tomb, we see some variability in the coloring of various peoples, Nubian, Egyptian men and women, and so on. And similarly, we see people like Maherpri, a high military official, represented in dark coloring. So again, no bar. Oops, my cat decided to go ahead, and I will go back again. All right, you. Sorry about that. My cat decided to take over, as cats will do. And so Maherpri is represented here with dark skin, and yet rose to one of the highest positions in Egyptian authority. And we see this more generally in Egypt, the presence of Nubians who were able to enter into Egyptian society from the earliest times all through pharaonic civilization. Interestingly enough, we also have signs of cultural entanglement with Maherpri. He's wearing an Egyptian kilt and costume, but Nubian style armlets and bracelets of ivory, a kind of ivory choker, an Egyptian amulet around his neck, a Nubian hairstyle that by this time had become standard for the Egyptian military. So we see mutual influence between the two civilizations, not Egypt imprinting its own civilization onto Nubia. And our work at Tombos has continued to look at these questions of cultural entanglements and the back and forth, even in the context of empire. So Tombos was established as an Egyptian colony around 1450 BC, but interestingly enough, lasts after the end of the empire, around 1070, all the way through the period of the Kushite dynasty. And what we see is the emergence of an entangled culture, but a kind of multicultural, multi-ethnic society. So we can see Egyptian-style pyramids on the one hand, Nubian-style tumuli on the other hand, Nubian-style burials. Interestingly, that flex position, always of women. So there seems to be a kind of intersectionality going on here as well. Nubian-style pottery continuing to be produced, and yet some of these Nubian women having Egyptian-style amulets in that kind of entanglement. These entanglements only increase as we move into the Kushite period. And here you see an example of a tumulus, very Nubian-style superstructure, where the substructure is Egyptian, east-west oriented shaft, the body with head to the west facing towards the east in the rising sun. We have evidence of bed burial, a very Nubian practice, again, blacktop pottery continuing, but also the use of coffins and indications of wrapping, probably mummification. And similarly, a mixture of Egyptian-style amulets, but selective. Certain deities appealed and took on even a heightened role in Nubia from Egypt, especially the god Bes. You see one example here, the goddess Isis as well. Patekos, the dwarf god, also extremely common in Nubia. We also see Nubian types of jewelry continuing. We find lots of ivory bracelets and beads and so on of a very Nubian style. Red Sea shell, so Nubia was also very much connected with the broader East African world. Glazed quartz, a very distinctively Nubian thing. And a very interesting scarab that on the one hand looks very Egyptian, but there is in fact no parallel from Egypt for this scarab. It's rather large, and the scene of offering bearers is absolutely unique. So we see not only this kind of entangled culture, but at some point these elements cease to be either Nubian or Egyptian and become just a thing for the people living at a place like Tombos or at Napata, the capital of the Kushite dynasty. And so they're starting to produce things that superficially look Egyptian, but in fact are novel, are innovative, are new. And so it's through that lens of two African civilizations interacting together and deeply entangled with deep relationships that go all the way back to that green Sahara, that we should view both Egypt and Nubia. And we should definitely, I would argue, see Egypt as a fundamentally African civilization and not a fundamentally Near Eastern civilization. We should recenter our approach on Egypt from an African perspective. And that's where I'll wrap it up right now and turn it back over to Vanessa to moderate.
Great. Thank you all. I think that was very helpful to briefly introduce everyone to your various perspectives. So for those of you just joining us, please put any questions you have in the chat. I will continually be checking that. And we have a few questions there now. The first question is,
worldview. And so if we are to describe the theological aspect of the Hamitic hypothesis, it has its genesis, pardon the pun, in the book of Genesis, in the story of Noah's curse. Noah has 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And in the story in Genesis 9:18-26, Noah curses his grandson, Canaan, for, in a vicarious way, apparently, for his father, Ham, looking at Noah's nakedness. And so in the theological realm, Noah's curse has been taken as some kind of historical forecast that it's going to determine outcomes of nations and ultimately races, at least from the modern perspective, throughout the course of history. And so interpreters who were fundamentally Christian looking at this, especially with relationship to the transatlantic slave trade, found a fitting pretext for enslaving Africans. Hey, here is a moral justification. They could assuage their consciences, anesthetize their Christian consciences by appealing to this biblical precedent. And so Negroes were apparently preordained for slavery in this iteration. And so, in fact, of course, you had previously inchoate aspects of the theological idea of Blackness and slavery. We see some of this in Muslim and even Judaic literature in the medieval period. But for the most part, those were inchoate speculations that were kind of galvanized and weaponized in the context of the transatlantic slave trade. However, the exploration of Napoleon in 1798 and beyond, the French scholars began to, discovered ancient Egypt and this magnificent civilization. And in the theological aspect of the Hamitic hypothesis, it was supposed that all Hamites were cursed to perennial slavery. So when Napoleon's scientists began to study ancient Egypt in this context, ancient Egypt turned out to be a magnificent civilization, one that was advanced in culture. So there needed to be some kind of disassociation between the Black Hamite African slave idea, and now this new idea that, you know, Hamites had created this magnificently splendid civilization that was seen in many respects as the progenitor of Western civilization. And so there was, and of course, French scholars were saying this civilization is the creation of Africans, of Negroid, scholars like Volney and Denon and others. And so there needed by necessity to be a disassociation from Black Africa and Hamites to basically spin the narrative to suit the purposes of this new interpretation. And so scholars, largely European scholars, those in the what we call the American School of Ethnology in the 19th century, began in earnest to reinterpret the evidence. And so there needed to be a more critical scrutiny of the biblical text. And of course, it turned out that it wasn't Ham that was cursed after all, but only Canaan. And the curse did not involve anything to do with Blackness. And so over time, Blackness was stripped away from the Hamitic hypothesis, and a new iteration of this theory came about, which was what you mentioned earlier, that the Hamites were Europeans after all, Caucasians from the Caucasus, that brought the civilization to enlighten the rude Black peoples of Africa. And so the Hamitic hypothesis took on a new scientific spin and started being proliferated in a number of disciplines like anthropology, Egyptology, ancient history, et cetera, to now explain how civilization got to Africa in the first place. And so any kind of civilization or semblance of civilization was now the birthright or the work of pastoral Hamites from Europe, or at least in some cases from the Middle East, but not African. They brought civilization to Egypt, and therefore disseminated this in the rest of Africa. So I'm going to pause here. My colleagues can probably chime in as they see fit.
Yeah, what I wanted to say, thank you, Dr. Burrell, for that. I wanted to just, for some people who may not have the biblical knowledge background, that initial connecting of Egypt to Ham is due to the genealogy. So the curse that was attributed to people on the slave plantations, when Ham was seen as the progenitor of those people, the Bible was also saying that Ham was the father of Misraim and Cush. And so this is where the conflict in part comes in, because wait a minute, if Ham is cursed, then Egypt is cursed and Cush is cursed. But in that particular genealogy, the question of where these, quote, Negroes on the plantation came from was not totally clarified. And then of course, later on, as you point out, in the hands of other people, the term Hamitic gets used, or Hamite gets used in another way, although those people using it weren't necessarily interested in the Bible. Now, I will say the person best known for the Hamitic hypothesis in my part of the academic world is Seligman, Charles Gabriel Seligman. Seligman did admit that some scholars thought that the Hamites had originated in East Africa. So even he says it in his book, but he falls down on the side of they were dark pastoral Europeans. And he actually says and this is an interesting contradiction, he says they brought some light or whatever to the dark agricultural Negroes. So he was actually allowing the quote unquote Negroes who have invented farming to be farmers, first. And so if you know anything about recent archaeology, farming and food production, specifically farming, is considered to be a big deal. That comes before, or it used to be taught, that came before pastoralism. Now, of course, we know that you can't say that. You can't say that. So the remnants of the Hamitic hypothesis persist in the sense today of somehow suggesting that Northern Africa, as I prefer to say, super-Saharan and Northern Saharan Africa, are somehow not really a part of Africa. So you still see studies done, and that's the backdrop. That's the way things are written and talked about. That's the background That's the hidden assumption. I would also say, though, that Gaston Elliott Smith, and this is relevant to what Deborah is talking about, and Stewart, Sir Grafton Elliott Smith, who did all of those anatomical reports along with others in the Nubian surveys and so forth. Grafton Elliott Smith, on the other hand, thought that the ancestors of the Egyptians had come from the Horn of Africa. Okay, and so here you have an interesting, set of contradictions going on simultaneously. And in his group, the brown race, as well as Seligman's concept of the Eastern Hamites, both Nubians and Egyptians were included. Okay, Nubians and Egyptians were both included in those taxa, and were not, quote unquote, real, quote, Negroes. Okay, so this gets into some ground in relationship to certain aspects of anatomical features versus just simply skin color. Okay, so this is where that conflict comes in, and a notion also about genealogy, because Elliott Smith also thought that the brown race had gone into Southern Europe. Okay, so, and some of the Italians didn't like that. All right, they had other ideas. Although there was another Italian called Giuseppe Sergei, who wrote the book, The Mediterranean Race, who did believe that there was something called the Eurafrican species. So we have all of this stuff going on, circulating, and it did cause, in some cases, conflicts amongst the colonial authorities. They were, they said, wait a minute, these guys over here writing this stuff about these people that we're trying to conquer, or these people we're exploiting. So yeah, so there's another dynamic underneath what Kevin has talked about, is what I'm trying to get to. As to the dynastic race per se didn't have anything to do with the Hamitic construct. When you look in the final edition of Petrie's notions, Petrie's book, The Making of Egypt, the final sort of summation, he brings them from Elam or Susa or someplace like that, the dynastic race. And it starts infiltrating in the so-called Sumerian. We would call it Nakata 3, but actually technically the two aren't the same, but close in time. And then of course, Dynasty 1. These dynastic people, he would have said, came from someplace else, although he allowed for indigenous local folk to be there. So there's always been a notion. So it becomes very curious now when we have people doing mummy genome studies, most notably the one in 2017 that seems to have almost just taken over by storm, and based on some very flimsy ideas and data. The one population sometimes called sub-Saharan and other times simply called African, which right there shows you a notion of African that is restricted. You can't restrict Africa. There were modern humans and fossils of modern humans and proto-modern humans in the Nile Valley, the Taramsa in Northwest Africa, as well as in Eastern and Southern Africa. So all of these hominid lineages probably contributed something to modern humans. So the idea that Africa stops based on, again, this is the remnants of the Hamitic idea that somehow super-Saharan and sub-Saharan and northern Saharan Africa are not a part of Africa, is a legacy of a particular kind of racial and sometimes racist construct. And I'll just say this about geography. The Nile Valley, the Egyptian Nile Valley, is in the Eastern Sahara Desert, basically. If you look at the map. The places in Africa that are actually above the Sahara are places in like Algeria and Tunis. So if you look at the map and you look at where the latitude lines for where the Sahara ends and begins. Once you start thinking that way, it forces you to think about things in a totally different way. And I would like to ask Stuart a question. Stuart, could we not also argue, just as people talk about Eurasia, could we not put forth a notion based on linguistics or whatever you want to base it on of Africasia, where we include the Sinai and Arabia in a construct and discuss things in that manner. That might even work better from a biblical point of view, but I just throw that out as an idea.
Yeah, that's actually a really interesting concept. And again, it's part of the idea of flipping the gaze. So the typical Egyptological gaze, and this is reinforced by the Hamitic hypothesis, is from the Middle East to Africa. And that's how North Africa becomes divorced from the rest of Africa, right? It's really part of the Middle East. And you can see this even in African studies and Africanist approaches, and this contrast between Black Africa and what's the opposite of Black Africa? I mean, it has to be white Africa, right? And how is that not racist? Frankly, it's all Africa, and I would argue that, like Shamarka pointed out earlier, you stick an ancient Egyptian on a bus in Montgomery in 1950, and they're not sitting in the front without creating a big stir. The idea of a sort of Middle Eastern centered approach is, I think, can be flipped on its head. And we know this from the Afroasiatic language group. And I'm not a linguist, although I studied both ancient Egyptian and studied with a very linguistic oriented Egyptologist. But we see a host of modern languages in Northeast Africa that are part of the Afroasiatic language group, and fewer languages in the modern Middle East that are descendants of, are related to those groups as well. So we can posit that as Chris Arrett has argued, and I think quite persuasively, that the Afroasiatic language group began in Africa and then spread. And again, as Shamarka pointed out, language isn't biology. Language can spread with people, without people. We see this in the spread of Arabic throughout various parts of the world, for example, without necessarily many actual people coming from the Arabian Peninsula. But the language spreads for a variety of different reasons. But I think we can look at that kind of counter-influence back and forth for sure. Another point I'd like to make is what was the person who asked the question very, very perceptibly alluded to, is the idea of the Green Sahara. And it surprised me for a long time, the resistance in Egyptology to acknowledging this new evidence. And in fact, I talked to Rudolf Cooper towards the beginning of his research a couple of decades ago. And this research in the Western desert of Egypt in the Sahara is, sorry, my cat decided to interject herself here. This is Isis. And I think this will make her happier. So this is, I mean, when we were talking, I said, oh, this is amazing. It's the first time I'd seen his research. It completely transforms things. And he said, well, yeah, I'm surprised that more people haven't picked up on this. And I continue to be surprised as well, because he documented all of these trade routes running across the Sahara. And these were routes that were running throughout pharaonic history. And so Egypt was not at all isolated. Egypt was connected probably with Chad, certainly a place like Yam, which has often been posited to be located in Nubia somewhere. Must have been west, either Darfur or the Unedi Mountains in Chad, for example, maybe even going as far as Lake Chad. And when you look at Egyptian historical texts, you can see this as well. So this kind of fundamental embeddedness is in Northeast Africa is something that is pretty clear. And then when you start thinking about this pastoral complex that existed, and you look at the surrounding cultures, you can see a lot of similarities between Egypt and other Northeast African cultures, both in modern terms and in antiquity as well. And Henry Frankfurt was another interesting scholar that, although he does play off of this Hamitic idea, he situates Egypt as a fundamentally African civilization. And against Petrie's idea of an Elamite origin, he points out that those little bits of Elamite symbolism that show up in early dynastic Egypt are quickly adapted and then abandoned and have no real profound impact. And instead, he, without Seligman's, I think, kind of explicitly racist viewpoint, he tries to develop a kind of ethnoarchaeology of Egypt, situating it within these Northeast African pastoral societies, widely distributed in different Nilotic groups that practice a kind of similar lifestyle that may have its origins back in that early formative period of the Wet Sahara. And the final point I'd like to make is that Egyptology has been entangled with the origins of scientific racism in the United States through the work of Morton, Knott, and Glidden. Glidden being an early Egyptologist, and I've been looking through biographies of early Egyptologists, and as far as I can tell, everybody gives him a pass on this. But he was not just someone who said, oh, this sounds like an interesting idea that the Egyptians weren't really African, that they were Arabs. He was an advocate for the Egyptians not being African. And as has been pointed out by others too, this is a kind of a fundamental underpinning of racism. So you can't have a racial classification where, where Black Africans are inferior and white Europeans are superior if Black Africans created ancient Egypt. So Egyptology became entangled and, in fact, a necessary underpinning of that emergence of that especially extreme version of racism that we see emerging in the context of slavery. That again, Dr. Burrell also has talked about in the United States, and it continues. I hope at a subconscious level within the discipline in terms of just a surprising resistance to acknowledge Egypt's African underpinnings, and in fact, just simply acknowledging that ancient Egypt was a Black African civilization, while recognizing the kind of diversity of phenotype that we see in the couple of images that I showed as well, but throughout Africa. So not at all inconsistent with Africa. And again, race is, it's a cultural construct, not a biological reality. So there is you can't divide people up into 4 different phenotypes. People mix, people interact, and you see a lot of diversity, and the more so in Africa is the origin of humans. So I guess I'll leave it there. But that wet Sahara, the green phase in the Sahara, is really a complete game changer, and I think it's not been fully appreciated.
Yeah, I'd like to point out something that I think is fairly important. Number one, there's a disconnect within the study of the Nile Valley. Let me generalize it to the Nile Valley. There's a disconnect between the archaeologists who do the epipaleolithic, even the pre-dynastic, and then the classical dynastic Egyptology. And this is a part of the problem. The dynastic Egyptologists, with few exceptions, when you say Egyptology to them, you're not even talking about the Badarian and Nakata and early Hierakonpolis. You're talking about things sometimes even after dynasties 1 and 2, the so-called, in Emery's terms, the Archaic period, or you're talking about Old Kingdom on. That's one thing I wanted to say. Also, I'm going to give a different perspective on this thing about Africa and using the word Black. I don't talk about Black African this, that, or the other. I talk about biohistorically African populations, by which I mean populations that emerged, that were assembled, and that were shaped in Africa. And I don't know how many Egyptians were this color or that color. I just know that, and to what degree and in what time there were inputs from different places, any more than in Greece. Okay, even any more, you pick the place you want to pick. You can find, for example, the R1 lineage that I think has been talked about recently in some of the Amarna mummies as a Y chromosome lineage. You can find that in a whole bunch of Africans who are jet black with full lips and that. The real question is, what does that signify in terms of population history? Is that a marker of a whole group moving, or is that something that dates from the Paleolithic time? It comes back to Africa, gets sloshed around in the Green Sahara, and then gets, later on after desiccation, winds up in different folks in different places. I think everyone here understands that concept. And so, so now we're talking about population history, population biology, and we're not talking about assigning things to races. Okay, the notion of race, by the way, if you say that a species is divided into X number of races or subspecies, you're implying something about the nature of its structure as a species. And when you start talking about trying to assign an identity, a racial identity, you're trying to assign something to one of those entities that have been predefined. Okay, so as opposed to talking about population affinity, where we're talking about showing relationships or similarities and then figuring out why they exist. This is a very different thing in terms of conceptually. I don't work from a model of racial identification. I work from a model of assessment of population affinity. And when I do my affinity work, and I'm totally open to acknowledging that when you add different data to it, that you're going to find some different things. And the issue of and that doesn't, and so what? That doesn't mean anything. Because if R1 came back, and you can find it amongst some Fulani, some Chadic speakers, who, by the way, don't look usually like Fulani, and some Egyptians and some Berbers and some this ones and some that ones, then it's found in different linguistic groups. It's found, and they're all circum-Saharan, remember that, and they're all old, and it came back a long time ago. So it's been reworked into different African populations under different social and environmental conditions in bodies. So these bodies are vessels for this lineage. Let us not, again, as I said, confuse gene history with population history. Your gene's ancestors may be very different than your ancestors, by which it sounds clever, but what it means, and I didn't originate it, it simply means that you may be carrying a gene, you might be, who knows, Stuart might be a descendant of Napoleon or somebody. He's probably more closely related to me at this moment in time than he is to Napoleon, or he might be related, I don't know, pick some Anglo-Saxon king, King Alfred the Great or somebody, so it doesn't deny the genealogical connection, but we have to situate it, and we have to contextualize it for it to mean something. Just finding some DNA, as some people are doing, or have in some mummies in Egypt, doesn't mean that the Egyptian population came from that place, wherever that place is. If you found some L1 Y chromosome, mitochondrial DNA, and some M78 or whatever. Ramses III is bearing E1B1A Y chromosome lineage, which is an old African lineage in the E. That doesn't mean wherever that lineage originated in Africa, doesn't mean that his daddy came from there or his granddaddy came from there. That stuff was all mixed up in the Sahara and the Nile Valley. But I fully acknowledge, and this is what I would say to Vanessa, Stuart, and others, we do know that the Egyptians from the proto-dynastic period had colonies in the Levant. We do, thereby creating a social basis for interaction. We do know that Thutmose and others imported or had foreign wives from Southwest Asia. And in fact, somehow a big deal was made up, probably because those were political marriages. We do know sometimes they have multiple wives. So, if you do a little math, multiple wives, multiple children, if they all survive or most survive, you're an elite. And then they all have lots of daughters and they survive, then you can actually change the genetic profile in a given region. In terms of that lineage, but doesn't mean you've changed who created the culture and who the people were. So I think that it's very important that we have a sophisticated view. The fact that Barack Obama became president of the United States did not change the US Constitution, as much as some people feared that it would. And some people apparently still fear that it would, based on what happened yesterday. So, no, we have to have a sophisticated view of population relationships, and we have to understand you have gene flow. It doesn't necessarily change culture. And in fact, you can have enough gene flow to make one population more similar to another one without either one of them changing cultures. And I think that's a very important concept to have in mind. One-way gene flow. If you have an island and there's people X on that island, and all of a sudden it becomes fashionable to get wives from this other place. And so all of a sudden they get wives from these other places, generation after generation after generation. And then if there's any differential survival of the children by those women versus the native women, you will change the population, but you won't change where the island is. The island's still there. You won't change what they call themselves. They're still calling themselves the people of Island X, even though they may have physically changed or genealogically definitely changed. And we have to, and we see this in front of us all the time in America. We just don't think about it in scientific terms because the water's been muddied socially around it. Anyway, I went on, but I think that's an important set of ideas to have about a complex place that does sit at the crossroads. But it's an African entity that sits at the crossroads. And it's an interesting place that they were open enough to accept people from other places. And we have hard data based on biochemical analysis of migrants coming from Southwest Asia. We have papers now. So they've been caught in action. I mean, actually, first generation in places where we know others came before and after them. And then they become assimilated in that area up there in Avarisa, and where what we call the Hyksos, where the Hyksos emerge or whatever happens to give us a Hyksos. It's been going on. We have records where the Egyptians say, oh, well, we settled so-and-so number of Asians over here. Okay. So, what I think, and I finish with this, we don't realize that it doesn't take a lot of gene flow per generation to actually change gene frequencies in a particular place or lineages. And we also need to remember that it's not just genetic similarity that's being altered, even though it's talked about that way. With gene flow, you also get new ancestors. So, that's important to remember.
Deb, do you have anything to add to this before we go to the next question?
Yeah, so I mean, because they've raised, just the discussion has raised like all these other topics and issues. But one of the things that I wanted to go back to was talking about the Hamitic thesis or the Hamitic hypothesis, because we need to also think about the way in which African Americans engage this. So during the late 19th, early 20th century, Black writers began writing about, trying to reclaim their history because they were denied a history. Hegel was like, Hegel stated that Africa was no part of the world history. It had no movement, and therefore we leave it never to discuss it again. So early on, there was this intellectual mindset that Africa had no history. And so the approaches of Egyptologists after this kind of grappled onto that to remove Egypt from Africa. Mm-hmm. Then you start saying, well, they characterized the Nubians as being this race of people that were dominated first. It was like, oh, but they were the 25th dynasty. Oh, so this dominated people rose up and took over. So they could not have been African or Black, because Black people can't do that. Because if you admit that Black people in history were able to rise up and take over, you don't want that getting out to enslaved people. Like, hey, it happened in history, we can do it again, because they're already trying to silence the Haitian Revolution. So we get to the point where it's like, we have to remove Nubia from Africa as well. So that double movement to dissociate both Egypt and Nubia with the Hamitic hypothesis. And then you had these African-American writers, they were like, hold up, no, that doesn't sound right. That's not right. So first of all, they pointed out, as Kevin said, that the curse was on Canaan. And Alexander Crummell in his book wrote, and he pointed that out. He was like, this is the discrepancy here. It was on Canaan, the one son that had no connection to Africa. Because Mizraim was supposed to be, you know, that's Egypt, Cush, that's Nubia. The other son was supposed to be Libya. So it's like there are four sons, but that one has no relationship to Africa. That's the one that the curse is on. So he pointed out that discrepancy, like you all are misinterpreting the scripture. But then you had this other turn where these African-American writers are like, okay, so not only was it not a curse on Ham, but we have these descendants here, Cush and Mizraim, they are the progenitors of the African race. So they are Black. So they started claiming that Hamitic genealogy, you know? So they turned the tables on the Egyptologists and the anthropologists that were trying to take the history away. It's interesting too, because, I mean, it's not interesting, it's you can just imagine they were marginalized. So even though they were pointing out these discrepancies, nobody was paying any attention because there was this purposeful attempt to keep them out of mainstream academia. So they created what I've called this alternative archive. So you don't even know that there was a pushback against this unless you know that alternative archive. Mm-hmm. That approach also determines how we studied ancient Egypt and ancient Nubia. So there's these two tracks about how you study ancient Africa. And if you look at it, I call the approach of the African Americans, the African Caribbeanist, these people in the Americas that were trying to reclaim the history, that to me, I call the longue durée of African history, because they believed that African history ran from not even just Egypt, but you had to go all the way back to the beginning. You know, Homo sapiens, he emerged in East Africa. And then before there's even a hint of an Egypt, he and she are traveling all over the African continent. So the time Homo sapiens is outside of Africa is just a small percentage of human history. Before they went out, they had gone all over the continent. So there's the largest amount of variation on the African continent because humankind has been there the longest. So they understood that. So they're saying that history is a part of African history. So if you take that and you understand origins and people moving around the continent, and then you take into consideration the Green Sahara. So you got people moving back and forth, east and west. Yeah. You got people moving north and south. You know, Egyptologists tried to say that the first cataract was this border, this boundary between Egypt and Nubia. And it's like, okay, if that were the case, half the people that left Africa would not have ever gotten out, because Egypt is the one place that's connected to another landmass. That's the only place on the African continent that's actually directly connected to another landmass. So if the cataract is an absolute boundary, people would never have gotten out. They would have had to walk all the way around the continent. You know, so some of these don't make sense, but people like William Leo Hansberry, the very first Africanist, it was not Melville Herskovitz, it was William Leo Hansberry at Howard University. He created this course where he's teaching history all the way from the emergence of humans all the way to his time, you know, African history. But he understood that Egypt was a part of that history, that Nubia was a part of that history, Ethiopia was a part of that history, all the medieval kingdoms were a part of that history. It's a longue durée, and there's a connection between them. as opposed to Egyptology, where you have to remove Egypt from Africa. So now you have African studies that only deals with a certain part of African history. They don't deal with ancient African history. You got Egyptology that only deals with this particular part of history, but they don't study the other parts of Africa. And so there's this disconnect. So what this time is just really good for is understanding how we got to this divided intellectual enterprise and start trying to bring the pieces back together.
Yeah. If I may just interject here, I think you made some excellent point, Deborah. It relates what you said in many ways to Vanessa's work with Du Bois and other early scholars who were pushing back, the dynastic theory, among other things. But I also want to go back to the Hamitic hypothesis and how Egyptology, I think Stuart brought this up, a very poignant point, how Egyptology contributed to the development of racism. And the fact that Egyptology actually helped to shift the argument in many ways, because, in the middle of the 19th century, in fact, before that, there was this contest, as it were, between two theories of human divergence, polytheism versus monogenism, versus polygenism. You see, it's the idea, of course, monogenism was the original idea that came even before the Enlightenment. The idea that human beings had somehow, diverged from an original stock, which monogenists like Blumenbach and others placed in the Caucasus region. And therefore, the more you moved away from this original stock, the more degenerate human beings became. And that's how you could explain the diversity that, European explorers were seeing in the world. Later on, another group of scholars, of whom Glidden and Nutt and these schools belong to, the American School of Ethnology, they were polygenists. So they believed that human beings were created as they were, as already diverged, already with their specific phenotypic features in these different places. And so you had these two concurrent arguments, both of which were contributing to the racial dialogue. And so when Egypt was discovered, and Glidden and others began to draw upon what they called, I guess, the monuments of ancient Egypt that depicted Black peoples. And they're saying, well, look at the Egyptian record that antedated the Bible. And look, we can see Negroes as surely as we can see them on our plantations here. We can recognize them in ancient Egypt. Therefore, this is an evidence, or this is an argument, that human beings from the very get-go were created in these differentiated phenotypic, with these differentiated phenotypic characteristics. And so the argument from Egyptology, really began to solidify the polygenetic argument, which was, of course, pre-Darwinian. This was before the biological evolutionary argument became in vogue. And so it took place in the context of Christian intellectuals that were trying to explain human diversity, and this was when racism started to really take shape and to come of age in the middle of the 19th century. So Egyptology contributed to that history by these Christian scholars looking at the monuments and saying, yeah, there are these differentiated groups that we see in ancient Egypt on the tombs and so forth. So therefore, they were polygenism is the more correct idea of how humans degenerated, or at least how human diversity came into being. So I think there's a number of things to consider when we think of early Egyptology, that certainly wasn't an innocuous pursuit at any point. It was always being used for political ends, again, to buttress the whole argument of slavery to justify slavery. I mean, if we're looking at the Hamitic hypothesis, it was part of a larger movement to discredit anything African from being advanced, from being culturally sophisticated, because we needed a moral justification as to why we're enslaving Black peoples. And I think we can't remove ourselves from these various streams of arguments that are trying to, so whether you're trying to suppress Black Africa, you're trying to explain away why the Egyptians were not Black, or why the Nubians were not Black, or with the dynastic argument, whatever these arguments are, they ultimately come back to one main issue. And that was we cannot enslave people who had a sophisticated culture, because then we won't have the argument that we are actually helping them. We're actually civilizing them. The white man's burden argument, the idea that we're civilizing these people by enslavement. Slavery is a good thing. But if that's the case, then you have to, by necessity, now go back and try to whitewash, so to speak, or try to suppress that history of a people in order to keep them, as you mentioned, Deborah. Because if you tell them that they were free individuals and people with a history and were empires at various points, they're going to get ideas of freedom, and that's not going to bode well for the institution of slavery. And this was, of course, the truth of the biblical argument, in the sense that even Christian institutions whitewash the Bible and have the slave Bible, because you have to take out those stories of freedom and take out those stories of liberation, because the slaves are going to be inspired by these stories and rise up for their freedom. So all of this, in my opinion, goes all the way back to this big issue of trying to justify why we have enslaved a whole race of people that are Black peoples. We must therefore, by necessity, get rid of their history by whatever means possible.
Yeah,
And,
I would like to.
oh, go ahead.
Oh, yeah. Now, I have a bad habit of complicating things, but I think.
Oh, if you're gonna make it complicated, then let me go.
No. But the complexity is why we went to graduate school, right? But no, what I wanted to just say is that what Kevin said, I believe that the fundamental thrust is correct. But I do want to point out, and I think, Deborah, you probably were going to bring this up, George Wells Parker, who was one of the early African-American scholars, who wrote a pamphlet, which I own a copy of, maybe even an original one, called the Hamitic League of America. There was an organization. So at that time, probably 1919, something like that, the word Hamitic had no negative connotation in their mind, because they were using the Bible and they were descendants of Ham, and that was a good thing. That was not considered. So and then later on, 1930 is when Seligman's formalized notion of the Hamitic hypothesis emerges as a hard thing, which then persists. Seligman's book was continued to be printed up until 1966, unchanged. Well, no, not completely unchanged, but those portions of that book, the key portions were unchanged. And I just think that it's important to say that, even with Hegel too, though. Now, to a different issue, Bernasconi, who's written a lot about race and the Egyptians and this, that, and other, a few key pages in Identity, he points out that Hegel actually was in a dilemma, because Egypt was in Africa. Hegel wasn't sure about certain things. So there are apparently, and I haven't studied it this hard, but I do have copies of those papers if you're interested. Hegel apparently, Bernasconi problematizes Hegel's thought and suggests that Hegel may have actually been tied in a knot and thought and basically in the back of his mind had to conceive that, well, maybe the Egyptians don't have the facial conformation, the physiognomy, the physical traits of certain stereotyped West Africans, but they have dark skin or black skin. And so he suggested that this may have caused a problem. On polygenesis polygenesis and monogenesis, the theological polygenesis thought that there had been different groups of Adam and Eves, as Kevin was pointing out. But the most racist, but the non-deist had the most racist, had another version of this, namely giving each so-called race a different primate ancestor. You may have seen a picture in that book. So you had the deistic polygenist who had different Adams and Eves all over the world, okay? And then you had the ones who thought in terms of, quote, natural history, and who had, and so that's an interesting conflict there between evolutionists and non-evolutionists. Scientists versus theologians, and the same with monogeism too. Juncker wrote a book, again, to talk about Hamitic hypothesis, but he wrote an article that I'm sure Stewart assigned to its students entitled "The First Appearance of Negroes in History." Have you all ever seen that piece? Okay, now, but I got a surprise for you. Vanessa will love this. It's none. Who do you think pushed back? Who do you think pushed back on the claim that Negroes first appeared in history, quote unquote, in the 18th dynasty or some very later period in Egypt? Who wants to guess? Well, anyway, I won't do that. None other than Charles Gabriel Seligman. Seligman says in his book that Juncker must be confused or must have a different definition of history or of Negroes, because guess what, Stuart? Seligman himself says, for on the great palettes of early Egypt, we find clearly the Egyptians defeating on the battlefield people who can be nothing but Negroes. Seligman says that, not me. Seligman says that. So Kevin's point is even stronger than he thinks, because all of this complexity, which I used to bother my supervisors with and needle them, because at some point the complexity has been forgotten. The nuance is, you see what I'm saying? They don't teach this in school. You have to go read all this different stuff yourself. If you don't read it, then you won't see the connections and the contradictions. You get what I'm saying? And I say that to the people listening to the conference. And there are even contradictions in Not and Glidden. Get Types of Mankind, that book, and read the chapter on Egypt. And you tell me if you think it's as clean cut as we make it out to be when we call them in a very easy way. Well, these are the racists and stuff. Yeah, they said some very racist stuff. They most certainly did. But in another place, when confronted with certain types of artistic evidence, they had to, well, wait a minute. Really what they were doing is just they saying, well, but these people don't look like us. That's really what they were doing. They don't say it that way, but they say, wait a minute. So, and you can read this. And they even claim that Morton changed his mind. Okay. Not in Glidden said this, not me. They said it. So then the question is, what do we do in the history of ideas? How do we work with these materials to comment on this? And even for Stewart, talking about the Wet Sahara, there are books going back to the 50s where you have some of the French writers writing papers like the Sahara fruit, Egypt fruit of the desert. So there were some people speculating then about the Saharan impact on, on early Egypt. But again, dynastic Egyptologists weren't interested in that stuff, other than Henri Frankfort.
Well, thank you all. This was an incredibly full answer to this question. I wonder if we should move to the second question.
Okay, all right.
There are actually quite a few questions that came up about Maherpuri. And so I'm going to kind of read through, there's a few, so I'm going to read through all of them so you have a sense of what the full set of questions are. Is it possible that he was simply a dark-skinned Egyptian? Moreover, could the exchange of hairstyles in the New Kingdom not simply be used because they're part of an African cultural matrix? Is his hairstyle Nubian or Egyptian or composite? Could you discuss in more detail? And hang on, there's one more. Yeah, and could you say more about his bio and if there's any info to shed light on his self-presentation with the dark skin tone?
Vanessa, do you have the PowerPoint?
Yes. So I'm going to share a screen, which are some images to add to what we've already seen. But it's going to take me just a sec because I'm slow. Okay, here we go. Does that look good?
Yeah, but that's not the one.
So I just need to scroll through. This one or this one?
Yeah, either one, yeah. So the thing about Meherpre, and this has raised questions before because people want to know, well, when we're talking about, especially when we're saying, you know, that there's no concept of race, and so people push back and say, well, how can you say that he's Nubian? Well, one of the things that we have during the 18th dynasty particularly, there are these very kind of stereotypical depictions of people, not racial depictions, they're more ethnicity or where people are from, geographical. In the case of Meherpre, you can see, this is from the Book of the Dead, of that was along with his burial. And like Stuart pointed out before, it's not just the fact that he's dark skinned. It's not just the fact that the hair, but there are other indications that he's showing his ethnicity as opposed to being just a person living in Egypt. And you can see in this particular one, he's wearing a choker, there are the bracelets, there's the armlets, there's this other kind of necklace. And so we also see this in the 25th dynasty, when the Kushite kings represent themselves as Egyptian pharaohs, but they still wear these kind of distinctive pieces of jewelry that, you know, show that they are Nubian, that they're coming from Kush. So in this way, we see in these kinds of depictions that there are these little simple nods to, this is where I'm from. So this is his own self-representation, you know, so he had this made with these different flourishes, with the choker, with the necklace, with the bracelets, with the armlets. So he's showing, yes, I'm dressed as an Egyptian, I'm in Egyptian pose, but I'm also Nubian. And there's nothing wrong with that. You know, that he's basically showing where he's from. And I think that if you look at in the other context, if you can go back, and I don't know if Stuart wants to bring up something here before we go look at the other depictions.
Yeah, just what you said.
Okay.
But also in terms of the hairstyle, which is really clear in that earlier shot, we see, you know, broadly speaking, this kind of hairstyle going all the way back to the Old Kingdom. So it's nothing new in the way it appears, and it appears in different contexts. In a New Kingdom context, it seems to be particularly associated with the military. And it's not always people who are represented, at least in the Nubian with stereotypically Nubian features. So, for example, on that same painted box of Tutankhamun that I showed that image from, you see a soldier who looks Egyptian, who has exactly the same hairstyle, and then you see some of his Nubian opponents who have a similar hairstyle. So, so I don't think it's necessarily so marked here, but I think it is an example of kind of Nubian military influence on Egypt, because there are a number of other features that seem to have Nubian origins. In fact, even the hieroglyph for soldier, the determinative in Egyptian hieroglyphics, is a little guy with a bow and an ostrich feather in his hair. And both the ostrich feather and the fame of Nubians as archers, acknowledged over and over again by the Egyptians. In fact, the name for the first Upper Egyptian nome, and then more broadly Nubia, is Ta Seti, the land of the bow people. So, or land of the bow. And the Nubians were known as Setiyu, bow people. So these features you can see, and we know that Nubians were, again, coming into Egypt, you know, for long periods of time. So that would be the only thing I'd add in terms of.
And if you think about Egypt and Nubia as being a part of a Nile Valley continuum, it doesn't really make that big of a difference that he's Nubian, you know, because he's a part of this Nile Valley cultural continuum. But the other thing, if you would, so now Vanessa, if you can go back to the
Yeah.
Hui, the tomb of Hui.
The big picture.
Yeah. So this is from the tomb of Hui, who was the vizier under King Tut, 18th dynasty. This is one of those rare instances where you really get to see the variation amongst Nubians. So this is the tribute scene coming from the south. So if you will go to the next slide that shows a little bit better, yeah. So you can see even, first, second, third panels, there are a variety of colors of browns, but they're Nubians. Okay, so if you go to the next one. Okay, so this is the first panel. The princes so there are princes, various parts of Nubia. The princes in the front, or the chiefs or the high officials, those are from Lower Nubia, and they're depicted in a certain way. So they're wearing this particular sash. They have the feather that Stuart was talking about, but they're also, you can see that they're in different shades of brown. So you have some that are very dark brown, you have some that are more reddish brown, but they're all supposed to be Nubians. But then behind them, and actually the one that's bowed down, we have his name. So that's is that Hecanefer. And he's depicted in this kind of stereotypical Nubian fashion, but then they actually found his tomb in Lower Nubia where he's depicted as a straight Egyptian. So you have this different types of representation. But if you look at the princes behind those Lower Nubian princes, they are all in Egyptian wear. I mean, they're wearing the pose, they have the cloak. They look Egyptian, they're just in various shades of dark brown. And these are, and if you can scroll, Vanessa, and the next one, there. So these are the greatborns of the foreign land. So these are like the children of the chiefs and princes of different parts of Nubia. And that's the other thing that we have to understand, is that the word Nehesi that gets used to talk about the Nubians, Egyptologists interpret that word as Negro. Okay, there was no Negro in ancient Egypt, so that's wrong. But Nehesi seems to denote a particular group of Nubians. So you had, all the Nubians were not one group. You had different groups. So the Nehesi, you had the whatever Nehesi and whatever Nehesi. So they were from Nubia, but you had these different groups of people. And so you have these princes here who are from these different groups. They represent different groups. They're children of these people that are ruling in different parts of Nubia. And they're depicted, some of them have the straight braids. So like the one in the front has the braided hairstyle that's coming down. But then you have others that have the one on the other end, his hair is kind of like orange with a side lock. So you have varieties of appearances, physical appearances, different shades of brown, different kind of hairstyles, but they're all these Nubian princes that are coming most likely to be educated in Egypt, in the nursery. And that's where we get with Maherpri, because I believe Maherpri said that he also was a child of the nursery. So that meant he grew up in Egypt, but he was from somewhere else. So he was most likely a noble child or a child of a prince that was sent to Egypt. And he came up through the ranks in Egypt. just like these princes here would have been. So there's no stigma to being dark brown. There's no stigma attached either on the Egyptian side or on the Nubian side. It's just a way of representing where they're from. It's more of talking about ethnicity.
Yeah, I would agree with exactly that. So, and there, you can look at these individuals and see a couple of interesting features. Again, a lot of ivory bracelets, which again, so this whole scene is actually really fascinating to parse because there's a lot going on in all of these different aspects. But just to point out a couple of things here, one of those, and then there are also tassels coming from, it looks like around the elbow area. And you don't really know what those are, but they aren't a thing that we see elsewhere. So it seems to be something distinctive. So again, there's a degree of diversity here, not only in the way people are depicted in color and so on, but other ways. It's also interesting, and it's something I've tried to wrap my mind around, but it's fascinating that they're wearing, what is it called? I think they're called tauruses, these kind of crown, golden crowns on their heads. And we do see this with some of the elite and deities as well. And the woman in front is also wearing one. So that's something that makes these guys really stand out too, which is intriguing. And yet you have Hecanefer who's performing this what Antonio Leprino has called the foreigner topos, presenting and subjecting himself to the king, who is thereby taming the forces of chaos that surround Egypt. The term Nehesi too is something I've written about, and that's a term where Egyptologists and Near Eastern historians have tried to create what I think of as a false etymology that would make it equivalent to Herodotus's use of the term, that idea of the copper colored or something like this. But it requires taking a Semitic root and transforming it to be something like the Egyptian root. But in fact, there is an actual Egyptian word, and it means to bite or sting with the root of Nehes. And that makes perfect sense for Nubians because, again, of their fame as archers. So if you think of them as stinging, with archery, it seems highly plausible to me. Another scholar, African-American scholar, suggested, also reasonably plausibly, although it takes a little bit of a step farther to justify, that it could have to do with the performance of magic and a story from the Egyptian lexicon of the fame of Nubian magicians. And that could be a reference to. I find the stinging part is plausible just because there's so much imagery surrounding bows and bowmanship and Nubians that it makes a lot of sense to me. Also, a term like Nehesi, one of the things about ethnicity is that it's what's the word I want? It operates on different levels. So a term like Nehesi could be used to refer to a specific group, or in a specific ideological context could be used to refer to Nubians in general. And the same thing with Tasseti or any of these other terms. So it's important to recognize that there were diverse groups of Nubians who might have different ethnonyms, but that also the Egyptians might, on certain occasions, collapse those down into a single term that again keys into that ideology of Egyptians and the other, whether that's Nubians, whether that's Asiatics, whether that's Libyans. And it's also important to recognize, again, in exactly the point you made, that there was no sense of color prejudice or discrimination in kind of life in ancient Egypt, that a lot of Egyptologists would say, oh, Nubians were singled out as the barbarians. But this is absolutely not true. Egyptian texts and representations present people from Western Asia and Libyans as just as barbaric, as just as threatening, as just as disorganized and easily defeated by the king. And so it was the Egyptian self surrounded by others all around them, not just an opposition between Egypt and Nubia, which is kind of mapping, again, modern racial prejudice onto an ancient situation. So. And then Bahipri it is actually a title child of the nursery. And so that indicates that he was raised with a king. And so it's a bit of an assumption, but a reasonable one, that he might have been taken into the court as a representative from one of these Nubian princes, one of these guys that we see here effectively, and raised with the king only a few decades earlier than this image. And we know that for sure was practiced with the sons of princes from Western Asia. So it's a known practice. They get that title, so it makes sense that was Maherpri's origin. And I love his name. I included the translation in my slide, the lion on the battlefield. So
Yeah.
apparently he was, sort of well-known. His military prowess was well-known enough that his name is like that. But it also is kind of an unusual name. Well, it is an unusual name. It's not a standard Egyptian name. So that suggests perhaps he had a Nubian name, but then was given that name, perhaps in recognition of his ability or intended profession.
If I just interject really quickly, I'm really glad you mentioned some of those points, Stuart, because sometimes people have the idea that we're saying that the ancient Egyptians had no ethnic prejudice, like they had no prejudice against anybody, but rather the argument is that their prejudice was indiscriminate. They had the same attitudes towards people from the north, the south, the east, the west. They were all, forces of chaos to be controlled by the pharaoh and so on. So I'm glad you brought up those, and of course you've written quite extensively on that. I think one of the question that came in, it's sort of the way I understand it, it's almost suggesting, to justify why there are Nubians in Egypt. Are you sure Eckanefer is a Nubian? And I think we need to look more broadly. I mean, if a Nubian is in Egypt for 3, 4, 5, 10 generations, is he or she still a Nubian? And so we should also recognize that Egypt and Nubia shared a common border, right? So it's like, let's say France and Germany, or Mexico and the United States. There's going to be a lot of overlap over time. And if you share a common border, over thousands of years, and a Nile River that people, this was the highway, okay, that you traveled on this highway for trade and diplomacy and name it, you're going to have a lot of millennia of interaction between these people with and especially if there is no racial boundary that separates, let's say, black and white races, which is exactly what we're saying. People moved not necessarily freely because of various ethnic conflicts and so forth, but at various times moved between borders, and the fact is that there is a long history of interaction between these peoples. We can think just simply of the Egyptian army, that Nubians, as far back as we go, were part of the Egyptian army, an important part of the Egyptian army. As many scholars would say, there's hardly a battle represented visually or textually where Nubians aren't part of that. So they were part of Egyptian society from the beginning. And so I just want to point that out just to support your work, which you've all been writing on in this field, because just the way that I perceive the question is almost that the person is saying, are you sure that, these markers suggest that they're Nubians? We're saying that Nubians were part of, just like other populations were part of ancient Egyptian society from the earliest times.
And on another, you can't see it, but there's another register where the people are wearing that kind of choker that he showed. Oh yeah, so you can see that they're wearing chokers, and yeah, you can see that. But there's another one, like on the second or third register, where almost everybody is wearing a choker. So you have these certain kinds of, I would say badges, but there's certain kinds of things that kind of show the ethnic identity. And you, I mean, in Maherpri's, in his defense, or in his case, he had that made himself. You would go and have you'd start taking care of your burial, as soon as you could, because you wanted to make sure that you had all the things in order. So in doing that, so it's a matter of self-representation. So nobody is, he's taking on these kinds of symbols to show where, like I said, where he's from. And again, if you take Egypt and Nubia as being part of a Nile Valley continuum, then it really doesn't make that really big of a difference. You know, I'm here where I am, but I always say that I'm a Southerner. You know, I was born in Georgia, grew up in Tennessee. No matter where I end up, I'm always going to say my roots, my home is in the South. So it's one of those things where you kind of show where you're from. Like I said, the 25th dynasty kings from Kush always wore, in their depictions, they always had these things that showed that they were specifically Kushite, things that you would not see non-Kushite Egyptian pharaohs wearing. It didn't mean that they considered themselves to be lesser pharaohs. They were just showing that this is where I'm from. I'm, as we would say, I'm representing.
To some extent with the Kushite pharaohs too, I would say that they were making Egyptian kingship, Kushite kingship, right?
Yes.
They're transforming it in the same way that our folks at Tombos, you know, are forging a new kind of cultural constellation and you know, potentially ethnic identity, but you can see it in a number of other ways. But again, you know, these things are not, you know, are incorporated, and they're the Kushites, especially the later Kushites, and you know, this gets on into Deborah's territory as well. You know, they're starting to riff off of ancient Egyptian things in ways that are completely innovative and not at all imitative.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you know, far from being a sort of cultural backwater, as some Egyptologists have argued, in fact, it's incredibly generative, and they're doing all sorts of really creative things and creating new theologies that, yeah, you can see the Egyptian roots, but they're doing kind of their own, they're really making it their own, doing their own thing, which is really cool. And I think you can see that with guys like Mahepri, who's you know, retaining these Nubian elements, but also, you know, interweaving those with Egyptian elements. And that's why I like this idea of entanglement
Yes.
as a way of looking at things.
I have a question. Is it fair to ask or to point out that, you know, considering the evidence that we don't have, let me say this correctly, from a statistical point of view, we have these particular tomb paintings that we talk about, that we refer to, but these are not nearly all of the representations that would have ever been made. So we actually have a fragment of all of the representations that were ever made. So I would argue that we're missing perhaps a part of the story. And then, and also, I think it's very important to drive home to many people that when we say that they didn't have certain concepts, at least when I say that, I'm also saying, in addition to what you've said, I'm also saying that there are papyri, or there are documents on medicine, there are treatises on this, that, and other, and doing spells. There are no treatises on human variation that divide people up based on somatic traits. There are no treatises like that. There are comments like in the Attend, the Hymn to the Sun that Stuart talks about, where they make note that different people the people may have different physical traits, but there's no treatise. There's no equivalent of a scientific treatise on this. So, or a sociological treatise where they develop a theory of this, that, and the other. And I think it's very important to say that, to dissuade people from imposing their ideas onto representations and portraiture and so forth. Is that fair?
Yeah, and one thing that I wanted to bring up before we move on is to talk about time, you know, different representations over time. So this is during the 18th dynasty. And so you can kind of see the variation here, but there are other depictions in the 18th dynasty where, and Stuart had the one on King Tut's chest, where, you know, he's running over Nubians, but of course you have fan bearers behind him. But you have these depictions that have been selected by Egyptologists, and also texts that have been selected by Egyptologists to say, hey, they really did not respect the Nubians. In fact, they considered them to be, you know, they degraded them, they considered them to be lesser than. And we have to understand a time period. So the 18th dynasty, the New Kingdom, this was a period of empire. Egypt had a massive empire that stretched all the way down to the Fourth Cataract in Nubia and all up through the Levant, at one point all the way almost to the Tigris and Euphrates River. So they were engaged in empire building. So a lot of the depictions, these negative depictions that you see, they're political propaganda. And you'll also see one of the things that kind of gets picked out, you'll see like on King Tut's chest, you see the depiction of him like running over Nubians, but on the other side, you see him running over Asiatics. So anytime you see that, you'll see it's not just Nubians that are being depicted in that way. And that's, again, is going along with what you're saying, Shamarka, and also what Kevin said. They're showing their dominance, their ideological dominance over all lands, over all foreign people. So it's not just the Nubians, it's also the Asiatics, it's also the Libyans. So you'll see this kind of defeated enemy image with all these different representations of different groups of people, because they're showing their ideology that they dominate the world as they know it. So I think that that's an important point to point out, because some people take these images literally. And what Stuart's work has shown is that you can't take that literally. That's not what the archaeology shows about how people actually lived. You had Egyptians and Nubians living in these areas together, and there's not that evidence of defeat, you know. So I think that's important to point out.
Stuart, I would like to even ask, but I'm enlarging it. I'd like to enlarge it. Is it possible that the depictions where they are depicting Nubians, and for that matter, even Asiatics, that they're depicting a particular group of Nubians, either from historical memory or in real life, that there were other groups of Nubians who were their allies? In other words, that depiction is based on a specific enemy, and just as we've said, just to be consistent, there would have been different Nubian groups or different Southerners, different groups, different Asia, and that some of them would have been allies and would be invisible. You will not see them being trampled because they are part of the family, or part of the crew, maybe not the family, but no, part of the family too. Is that possible?
Yes, absolutely. And that's the thing about ethnicity is it's constructed, and we tend to think of it as an essential category, right? You're born into a certain ethnic group and that's it. But the reality of ethnicity, even when we look at it in modern times, is that it's socially contingent, it's culturally constructed and mutable. And so it plays out differently in different contexts. So while in the case of ancient Egypt, you do see a stereotypical Nubian facing off against a stereotypical Asiatic and a stereotypical Libyan, like Deborah mentioned, and you see enshrined in Tutankhamun's box with even just the northern and southern enemy, the Asiatic versus the Nubian being defeated by the king. Interesting enough, the top has him hunting wild animals. So that's another interesting juxtaposition of all of this. Again, sort of chaos and the king taming chaos and bringing order is the theme. But we know from texts, for example, that Nubians, came to Egypt. They were part of the Egyptian military. They were, as Deborah pointed out, although the ideology homogenizes Nubia as the stereotypical enemy, we know that Nubia itself was diverse. There were various different kinds of groups. And you can see this partly in the Egyptian texts as well. They're fighting against certain groups while allied to other groups. The Medjay are usually thought of as Nubian. and are kind of the generic reference to a kind of pastoral nomadic group. We have historical references to them being very much engaged with Egypt, but there's no reason to think that other Nubian groups wouldn't have been as well.
Yeah.
So it's, we don't want to homogenize Nubia either, and realize that there may have been some people who were, some groups within that larger category of the region that were in fact engaging in very positive ways with ancient Egypt, which is why, as Deborah pointed out, you have to look at the context in which this imagery appears in order to really understand what's going on. And that really is highlighted by this image here of Hekenefer and the Lower Nubian princes. Again, we have a long history of tombs like Jehutihotep that I showed, Hekenefer's tomb himself, as Deborah pointed out, where in self-representation in their tombs are presenting as Egyptian officials, so much so that people, as someone mentioned, I can't remember who, maybe Shamarka, that people question whether or not they were, Nubian at all. No, I think it was Kevin. But anyway, that they might have been just Egyptians who were installed in these offices of Nubian prince. But in fact, there's no reason to think that they aren't actually Nubian princes, but that they are self-presenting as Egyptian officials, because that's kind of at the core of their power and identity in terms of their presentation in their own tombs. The Hekenefer here in this context is in the tomb of the vizier, who was receiving formally the tribute of the foreign lands and presenting it to the king, so in an ideological context. And I think that in fact, this does represent a kind of reality, in the sense that Hekenefer and these Nubian princes had to play the role of the topos of the defeated Nubian. And so for the purposes of this event, dressed up. And we have plenty of modern parallels for these kinds of events. The one I've talked about most is the British colonial Durbar, which some people, some Egyptologists have just simply applied and said, oh, well, it's the same as Nubia, and argued that it represents a kind of celebration of Nubian identity aligned with British colonial ideology, that the Maharajas of India were kind of competing to show off their wonderful ornaments and jewels and other things as they acknowledged the crowning of the new British emperor of India, and acknowledged the power of the British Empire. But in fact, if you start reading behind the scenes and look at how anthropologists have viewed these Durbars, colonial Durbars, and how Indians themselves viewed it. Gandhi has a great story where he asked the Maharajas, well, why do you put on all this frippery and finery, to our colonial overlords? And they said, well, we got it, because we get sanctioned. And one of them even rebelled and threw off his finery, and there were questions raised in the London Times, and threats to his position and all this kind of thing. But he very clearly, deliberately, did this. And in fact, there's a relation of a little quip that he made when someone commented to him, one of the other Maharajas, who was a little more in line with the British colonial apparatus, said to him, oh, isn't this a wonderful event? And he said, well, yeah, except that I feel like an animal in a circus. And so you kind of wonder what guys like Hekenefer felt in this particular kind of context. But it's important to realize that these things, identity is complex, situational, it's contingent, it's mutable, and it plays out in different social contexts. So you're talking specific about ethnicity, you need to think about what the social context of the representation is and why it might indicate that ethnic affiliation. And here I think it's quite clear.
You all. Sorry, Kevin, did you have something else to say?
I really was just going to add that I study the ancient Near East in biblical studies, and sometimes biblical scholars tend to remove Cushites from the Hebrew Bible, from the ancient Near Eastern context. And just to kind of go a bit further than what has been discussed here, Cushites were not even just restricted to Egypt, but that they had influence as far as the ancient Near East, as far as in Jerusalem, way before David set it up as his kingdom, his capital. there are Kushites mentioned in the Amarna letters as oppressing some of the Canaanite citizens, and soldiers are being requested from Kush, Meluha, or Kashi to defend or protect many of these sites, many of these cities from incursions from foreign groups and groups that were threatening the Canaanites. So the Apiru, for example. So the Nubian presence was not just in Nubia and in Egypt, but extend beyond those borders into the ancient Near East in significant ways, especially as in the New Kingdom, especially in the Napatan period in the 25th dynasty, when we have Taharka and the Nubian pharaohs, which are recognized in the Bible as pharaohs of Egypt, making a bid for control with Assyria for the ancient Near East, for the Levant. And there's conflicts between these groups. Nubia was at its height, at its zenith at this particular point, and was a significant power that in many ways, and many scholars would say, even rescued or came to the rescue of Jerusalem and potentially negotiated peace settlement that saw the preservation of Jerusalem at a critical historical period. So we see Nubians not merely in the Egyptian scene, but beyond that, and exerting influence as far as into the ancient Near East, into the Levant.
Great, thank you all. So we have a question here about reaching the public. The question is, here we go. How can we work to counter preconceived ideas of race in the ancient world, especially among the public? Specifically, I'm thinking of the role of museums and other public institutions that deal with material culture. How can we build on and expand shows such as the MFA Boston's Ancient Nubia Now, and preferably make the installations more permanent?
So I think that in talking about that, we have to look at work that's been done or is being done. Sally Ann Ashton, while she was working at, where was she? In
Fitzwilliam.
Fitzwilliam.
Yeah, she did a remarkable job reconceptualizing how you think about Egypt and placing it in an African context. So I think that that's one of the things that we kind of have to start thinking about is representation, especially in museums, because that's where, that's one of the avenues that the public gets information from. The other is from media. So we also have to think about representations in what I call these popular histories. So we've seen them in the past decade. We had Rise of the Black Pharaohs. And then there was another one about the Black Pharaohs. And actually we need to talk about terminology before we get off of this about the terms that we use, because Black Pharaohs is something that we don't need to be using because it suggests something that we're getting away from. But we need to start thinking about how we represent the Egyptians and the Nubians in the museums, but also in popular culture with documentaries and things of that sort. But I think as far as museums, I am so disheartened that the Museum of Fine Arts does not have a Nubian gallery right now. It's the second largest Nubian collection in the world, not just in the United States, not just in Europe, in the world, is in Boston, and it's not on display. And that is so heartbreaking to me when I found that out. And, so we really need to find a way to get If anybody knows how to get in touch with Beyonce and Jay-Z, that is my wish, that we have a Carter family Egyptian Nubian gallery at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. They could build a whole wing, but we really need to get some funding to get the Nubian gallery. I mean, because that is one of the places where, I mean, I'm always talking, I did an internship there in 2004. And so in my Nubian classes, whenever I teach Nubia, I tell them about, yeah, if you're in Boston, you need to go to the Museum of Fine Arts because, you know, you can see all these things on display. The Oral Institute has a Nubian gallery that's used for teaching. So we need to be actively engaged in making sure that the public knows about these spaces, but also that they're taking advantage of these spaces. I've worked with groups, so I've also worked with the Kemetic Institute of Chicago, and some of them are online, I see, but they would have teaching about Africa was one of their programs. That program would be for school teachers during the summer, so they would get continuing education so that school teachers could also take this information back and use it in the classrooms, because that's where we need to be starting. We need to be thinking about raising up generations of children who already know this information. So it's not new information when they get older. It's so sad when I have older people come up to me, you know, at the end of election say, why is it this the first time I've ever heard of this? Never heard of any of this in my life. You know, so to be able to tap into that when these children are forming their ideas about the world, you know, and about their place in it, to be able to use these museums as spaces where they can actually learn this history, but also see themselves in that history, you know. So there are things that we can be doing to engage the public that will have an impact past, you know, just the people that are there. We need to be thinking larger, educating the younger generations.
But I think what we're doing here is part of that, really. It's
Yes.
part of that movement to get this knowledge out there. You know, having Vanessa organizing this conference, you know, books are being published. It's Stuart Tyson's book that influenced a lot of my thinking on ancient Egypt and many others, of course. But, you know, I think there's a lot of work to be done even among scholars. Which, I mean, I wouldn't imagine that Vanessa or Stuart are, you know, considered, I guess, I don't know, mainstream Egyptologists, in the sense that you are absolutely professional Egyptologists, but your views aren't necessarily considered, you know, the acceptable view in every sense, in every respect. So your colleagues aren't lining up to disseminate your ideas. I'm sure there's a lot of pushback. If it's a question. There's a lot of pushback against some of the things that you are saying. Would I be correct in that? And yet you are out there publishing and getting this information out, organizing conferences. And yeah, I see this as part of that, getting the information out there. And of course, you know, conferences like this will influence a newer generation of scholars and a newer generation who are going to be disseminating these ideas. But change takes time. It takes time to change structures that have been in place, you know, for political reasons from the very beginning. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think the Nubia Now exhibit really provides a model for how to kind of rework galleries for ancient Egypt as well, and potentially to create a new gallery at Boston. I agree absolutely with Deborah. It's a tragedy that there's no Nubian gallery at Boston, and of course they have amazing Egyptian material as well. And the way you could frame those two, you know, in a kind of modern, critical way, you know, it just has a huge amount of potential. And that's, I think, not through any reluctance of the curators there at this point, but it's the administration of the museum that doesn't like this. So, like, you know, Beyonce getting involved would probably get their attention. So I agree with her. We need that. But I also agree with the point about education. I think education is absolutely critical, and school curricula often just gloss or even completely ignore Nubia. Although interestingly enough, in California, the standards kind of suggest Nubia, but I think there's not a lot of information out there. So I've done a couple of things like this, most recently at the African Studies Association meetings. There was a panel that I got or a session rather, that I got pulled into with all school teachers. K-12 school teachers, and that was great. I gave my presentation, and then we had a bunch of time for Q&A, and they're hungry for information about Nubia in particular. But I think also applying a kind of corrective to older Egyptological narratives about ancient Egypt, and then about the relationship, entanglements, and so on between Egypt and Nubia, but especially recentering Egypt in Africa. All of those things would be really helpful and useful. And maybe that's something, we somehow need to be pushing more for, and, working with K-12 school teachers, different groups, and different, venues like at the African Studies Association meetings, where we could, kind of bring that perspective into view and expose people to those ideas.
And I would add to that, that when you talk about Africa, when we talk about Africa, we also have to correct notions about what being an African is or means. There are many ways to be Africans. There are many different variations on lots of the different Nubians, and there were different Egyptians too, I'm willing to bet. In fact, I know that for a fact, but and different Libyans and different Carthaginians. I could go different people in Songhai, different citizens, any of these circum-Saharan societies, there was population variation, it was probably so, and this is just, and that concept may be hard for some people to grasp, but certain other people, it won't be so hard to grasp because they can look around in their own families and say, oh, okay. They can argue, they can think by analogy, which I think is a problem in the quote unquote establishment. The thinking by analogy is very hard for certain people who I won't call their names, but they start off, even mathematical approaches are designed around the idea of creating, decreasing within group variability and increasing between group variability. So the fundamental basis is built into the equations of things like discriminant analysis. And so the thing is that that presupposes a population or a group that's going to consist of uniform people who are fairly uniform, as opposed to people who may have had multiple origins or may be different on evolutionary bases. So I think I'm just saying we have to add that in and find a way and tie it all together. So that way, when students get the pushback, whether it's your students or younger or people who can, of an age where they would defend themselves, they can say, the ancient Egypt was an African society. Ancient Egyptian African. Does that mean that they all look like Kwame and Nkrumah? No, it does not mean that. It doesn't, and nor is that a prerequisite for being African. But you have to learn. We have to learn how to talk about that and learn how to accept it ourselves, because we will slip back in the language that reveals that we're making associations about this, that, other. Even some well-trained biological anthropologists, oh, this is more African. Well, what do you mean? I mean, what do you mean it's more African? Really, what they're saying is that it's more, it's more similar to a typological notion or a particular notion of a set of traits that have been defined in certain historical contexts as being African or Negro, actually, as opposed to some other ways of thinking. And it does take time to get adjusted to that. I assure you, I didn't just come up with this, last night. It takes a while for people to, work through that and say, oh, okay, I can see that now. I can feel that now. Oh, I got that now. Oh, okay. Yeah. That's worthwhile talking about. Very much worthwhile. I mean, adding into any discussion about this area,
Shamarka, I want to add on to something that you raised about, what does it mean to be African? Because that was one of the things, going back to Du Bois, when he was pushing back against the Egyptologists, he was arguing about their conception of the Negro. Because he was saying that you're saying that they're not Negro. So this is 1915 that he wrote this. He says, what is a Negro? We find the most extraordinary confusion of thought and difference of opinion. There's a certain type in the minds of most people, which, as David Livingston said, can be found only in caricature and not in real life. When scientists have tried to find an extreme type of Black, ugly, and woolly-haired Negro, they have been compelled more and more to limit his home, even in Africa. So he goes on to say, at least 9/10 of the African people do not at all conform to this type. And the typical Negro, after being denied a dwelling place in the Sudan, along the Nile, in East Central Africa, and in South Africa, was finally given a very small country between the Senegal and the Niger. Even there was found to give trace of many stocks. So he goes on to say, as a matter of fact, we cannot take such extreme and largely fanciful stock as typifying that which we may fairly call the Negro race. In the case of no other race is so narrow a definition attempted. In fact, it is generally recognized today that no scientific definition of race is possible. 1915,
Right.
W.B. Du Bois.
Yes. And the problem, and I know that book. I have several copies of it, and I can tell you that again, it's one of those things that I like to point out. How did this get forgotten? Du Bois is commenting on something that is apparent in he's writing letters to people, he's getting information, he's talking to certain people, and there clearly is confusion, or there's difference in opinion. Ehrman says in 1896, Adolf Ehrman says that, well, the Egyptologists are in dispute about, the race origin, that's his phrase, of the Egyptians. The ethnologists, by which he means the biological anthropologists, say there's nothing in the Egyptian constitution that would separate them out. You cannot draw a line between them, the Berber, he means Nubians, or the Tibu, people in southern Libya. Ehrman wrote that, not me, but these talking about German ethnologists who are saying this. But then he says, but the linguists say their language is most closely related to Semitic, so they must have come from Asia. So they talk about an Asian origin, but he is presenting two sides. You can also say, see, I like to read these people, these older writers, against current people who would say that some of us are being revisionist, or I mean, like me, I said, no. Let's look at what Denon says, who went with Napoleon. Denon says, I see these people. I said, when I see the Copts in Egypt today, they have certain traits. And Denon turns it on its head. He says, this is a genuine African character, and the Negro is an exaggeration. In other words, is an extreme variant. He's applying an evolutionary model. He's talking about ranges, and he's saying, well, these are Africans. Okay, again, my question. How did this get forgotten? How did this not get applied, whether you're talking about natural history or whatever? How did it get forgotten? Everybody knows the name of Ashley Montagu, right? I know, Stuart, all the anthropologists. The Ashley Montagu champion, right, of the no race, of saying, oh, race is a great myth, et cetera, et cetera. Well, without going into it, he in his early days, he was dealing more with the notion of race as a complex of biological, cultural, and linguistic traits. In other words, and also national character. Some people have argued that he's really fighting against the notion that the Jews are a race, that underneath this, okay? And there may be some truth to this. That really doesn't matter. But what's significant is that as late as 1960, in his textbook to physical anthropology, third edition, Ashley Montague repeats who from 1930? Now, this is Ashley Montague, who's the anti-racist champion. I say this to illustrate something about not knowing the full range of terminology, not knowing all the ideas associated with terminology. Ashley Montague repeats Seligman, and he says in that book, of course, he talks about all the different, quote, types of Africans, but but Ashley Montague, the great champion, hero of even mind for saying certain things, but then, things mean different things at different eras in history almost. Seligman says according to Seligman, the civilizations of Africa are who or what? The civilizations of the Hamites. Now, this is an anti-racist, allegedly. I believe that he was, but he was unaware of the ranking thing that Seligman, he didn't read Seligman well. He had a graduate student or somebody just grab a quote, and it didn't strike him that this was part of a hierarchical, a belief system, and what Seligman was saying about these Hamites. It didn't occur to him, or he didn't know. And see, I find that kind of contradiction interesting, or that kind of amnesia interesting. It's also something that we can use as scholars, as people interested in the history of ideas. We can use it to show that our heroes were not all perfect, but we can also use these ideas to read against people who would say, oh, well, you're just saying that because, oh, Deborah, you're saying that because you're Black, da, 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 da. And you can say, no, Ehrman said this, or Denon said this. You can even show, I can show you how you can show where Knott and Glidden became unsure. I can show you how to say that too. I can show you the passages. So I have no use for, and then the DNA people come along, the mummies and stuff. I'm interested in science too, but I am not a positivist. I am a realist, okay? And they're different in terms of philosophy of science. There's a big difference there, like I said, your ancestors and your genes ancestors may be different. So if I'm carrying a European Y chromosome, the issue is, did I get it 15 generations ago or 10,000 years ago? Did it pass into my region of the world? Or did I get it from my grandfather or great grandfather? And it makes a difference how you conceptualize the populations bearing those things. That's a very important idea. Very important idea. Very, very important.
So since Deborah brought up terminology, which she would like us to discuss before our workshop is over, we actually have a question that maybe can lead us into a terminology discussion. Is it correct to continue to collectively call these people from modern Sudan Nubians when there was no place in that region, Nubia? Doesn't that in itself continue the mischaracterization of these African groups?
There's always a problem when scholars or external observers describe things. In situations of power, those descriptions sometimes even become taken on by the people themselves, and so the question of was there somebody walking around 1,000 years ago calling himself a Nubian? I don't know. I don't think so, but I don't know. But there was nobody calling themselves a Sudanese 1,000 years ago. That's always been an interesting thing for me. Why is it that the Sudanese have held on to this Sudan, which is part of a phrase, Balad Sudan, land of the blacks, when in fact a lot of northern Sudanese also, and this is the thing going on now, by the way, where you have some forces out there in the Sudan and other places trying to say the Kushites came from outside of Africa. The Kushites came from God knows where, and And again, of course, that's wrong. So terminology is very important. And to answer that question directly, it's going to be hard to get rid of that terminology. But of course, you could come up with better ways to describe the situation, the people, the cultural complex that you have. It's going to be, it takes a while for any change, even if widely understood, to be accepted and deployed, even when it's, obvious.
Yeah,
That's what I would say about terminology.
it's also important to recognize that there are Nubians, right? I mean, there are people, these are the people that I work with on my project at Tombos. And, they are, my descendant community.
Right,
So,
but when does the word Nubian? When does the word Nubian itself? I think our audience member was concerned about when does the word Nubian emerge as Nubian is that an outside term, or is that a term that's indigenous to that part of the world? I think that's what they were getting at.
yeah, but it goes back to I forget the first attestation of it, but it would be overlapping.
3rd century BC.
Yeah. So there you go. So
Okay.
it goes back. So it is an indigenous term that goes back at least that far.
Yeah, and some even think, I mean, that Nuba comes from the Egyptian word for gold, right? So Nub, yeah, it comes from the Egyptian word for gold. But again, the Nubians are attested, yes, around the 3rd century BC. And the reason why I kind of dug into that, because from the Hebrew Bible, the people in that region are called Cushites, right? So Cush. And the Egyptians did call these people Cushites. So we don't know that the Egyptians called them Nubians, that term specifically. But they did, the ancient Egyptians did call them Cushites. So maybe that's what that question is alluding to. I think more properly, we can certainly say that, of course, the way that archaeologists use the term Nubian or Nubia is mainly geographically. It's not really describing the entire historical period. It's saying this geographic area, we're denoting it as Nubia because there were Nuba people here, at least from the 3rd century BC. But nevertheless, so yes, I think they are indigenous to the region, but in terms of chronology, they are much later, in terms of, it doesn't go back to, let's say, the New Kingdom or anything like that we know of, but it could, just that it's not attested.
Right, but also there's the issue, right? Of do you use a local, if the people call themselves that and that's become accepted, that's one thing. But I think they were driving at the idea that maybe if people had other local names, like they're Dongolawi or they're this or they're that, wouldn't it be better to use such a term? You see what I'm saying? I think that's what they were driving at. And those are questions that we can, that I struggle with. My wife's ethnic group in Kenya, the macro term is Kalenjin, but her subgroup is called Kipsigis. Well, Kalenjin was invented by university students in 1940 or whenever. It's not an ancient term, but Kipsigis probably is an old term. You see what I'm saying? So, so they become Kalenjin in certain circumstances, as Stuart would love to point out, and in other circumstances, they're Kipsigis. So when they're angry with the other Kalenjin, they're Kipsigis, and when their group, they're Nilotic because they're Southern Nilotes, by the way. And they have their own, you all are familiar with some of the writings and the sort of folk history of the Kalenjin that give them an origin in Egypt or close to Egypt. Are you familiar with that? Professor Sambu wrote an 800-page dissertation on this. So it's common amongst the Kalenjin. So my son told me, well, mommy said that, we're descendants from Egyptians. I said, well, it's not quite like that. I said, you're descendant from people who were pastoralists, who probably come from a place in the Sahara where the Egyptians also came from. And that I can stomach, but I don't want him saying that we came from Egypt. But that's how some of the people, and what I said is also true, my interpretation. But in terms of the folk history or what circulates, and Sambu And I can send it to you if you want. Sambu wrote an 800-page dissertation on this, and he's an expert in Coptic, very interesting. I think you'd find it, it's definitely a different way to think about history and the world. He got his degree at the University of Stellenbosch in South Africa. So it's not like he got his degree in a place that would have been friendly to all of his to certain ideas. He went through a lot of study, and he crafted something that was acceptable in terms of literature and history the way he did it. So it was acceptable to the university, to the canons of the university. So sort of comparative cultural linguistic civilizations type thing, So
I think nomenclature is extremely important.
yeah.
And, I think there's a movement North America and elsewhere for indigenous peoples to reclaim their identities and rename places and the like. I mean, the whole continent of Africa, if we think of it, is really coming from the Roman period, right? Where we call this continent Africa from
They didn't call the continent.
No, that's what I mean. A group of people, right? They call the Afrique, and eventually that becomes known, at least later on, as
people around Tunisia. The odd thing about it, I didn't send you some. I wrote something about that. The interesting thing about it is that the Africa for the Romans is in super-Saharan Africa. Africa for the Romans, with no qualifiers, is in the vicinity of now Tunisia.
Tunisia, yeah.
Okay.
Exactly.
But that's Africa for them.
Yeah.
And now, if you call that place Africa in some circles, that's not Africa.
Yeah.
And the Romans, if you go back in a time machine, they would say, "What do you mean this isn't Africa?" This is Africa. And Africa itself is probably a Berber word.
Or Libya, if we go back earlier, right? So the whole, I guess.
I mean, all of that. Yeah, I mean, but I'm just simply saying that, it's very interesting how these things. But nomenclature is important. And from a philosophy of science point of view, sometimes how you label things also dictates how you interpret them. So if you start talking about, we have sub-Saharan DNA and so on, and Eurasian DNA, that's how you're going to interpret. And what in that equation, there is no place for an indigenous Saharan DNA. You see what I'm saying? There's no place for an indigenous Saharan or a super-Saharan Northern Africa population. They've been written out. I mean, that language itself writes them out. So it forces a discussion in a particular way, which is incorrect from an evolutionary point of view, from a history of biological point of view, and the populations that are there in any historical sense. You see what I'm saying, right? So the language itself will structure your discussion, and sometimes force you into arguments. And sometimes those of us who even know this will get trapped into having a discussion in terms that we know are not correct, or terms that we know are insufficient or paradigmatically problematic. So no, we have lots of work to do in that regard, and it's about trying to be accurate and be truthful. This is not about any sort of manipulation or anything. I mean, if you say that so-and-so concept, the race concept, is invalid, then why are you still expressing things in certain things? You're not calling them races, but you're using the same groups in the same way. That's called intellectual dishonesty. Intellectual dishonesty. You should go to intellectual Siberia.
I think that's why everybody needs to be at the table when it comes to this business of academic endeavor, because if you're at the table, then you have a voice and you can say, okay, that term, has this particular connotation, and I can, that term doesn't necessarily represent what the other person thinks it represents, and you can add your voice to the discussion. So that's why this particular panel is an important part of this whole endeavor of trying to redefine things in the ancient context, which has implications for the present too.
And one thing you can keep in mind too is that, I mean, we have to have some kind of language to talk about these places. So when we're talking in general terms, then it makes sense to just pick something that makes reasonable sense and go with it. A term like Nubia, I think, is quite reasonable in that regard, although there's certainly room for debate. But also when you're talking about an ancient context and you have an ancient name like Kush, for example, then you can use that. And we do know that, you know, the Kushite kings refer to themselves as kings of Kush. So it makes perfect sense to do that. But if you adopt Kush as a generic term, then what happens to Lower Nubia, Egyptian Nubia? So I mean, there's no easy solution to this. But I think, again, thinking contextually.
Well, what
do you, about what to call things.
Yeah, I mean, no.
Contextually, I mean, you just have to, you know, think about what's the most appropriate term to use in that particular context and the way you're talking about it. So when I, you know, refer to the Kushite dynasty, sometimes I'll use Nubian dynasty just because, well, people do. But I do more often try and use, or at least I try to use Kushite dynasty more because it's the term that they themselves would use.
Yeah, well, the issue
Nubia, the term Nubia allows you the space to talk about various groups. And we just talked about the fact that you have all these different Hesiu groups within the region. So it allows you to talk about all these different groups that occupied this space. And basically it is a spatial designation. So you have groups that move in and out. So it allows us to talk about these various groups. We don't know the names of all these groups of people. Right. So you have to have a way of talking about it, contextualizing the people that occupied this space. And so Nubia allows you to do that. The Nubians that exist now, if you think about it, the Nubian languages that are spoken in the Nile Valley meaning Egypt and current day Sudan, Nubian languages are the oldest existing languages in the Nile Valley. So why wouldn't we use Nubia to describe the space?
Oh, let me ask you a question about it. So you believe that ancient Nubians, say A group Nubians and C group Nubians, you believe that they spoke Nilo-Saharan languages? Because not everybody does. Well, some people.
No, I'm not talking. No, I'm talking about the current Nubian speakers.
Right.
We can't conflate these ceramic groups with people. We don't
beat
know
me up too much.
Yeah,
I know. Don't beat me up too much. I know.
Although based on the Egyptian historical texts that mention, and it's pretty much all names as far as I know, maybe some toponyms. Going back to the Old Kingdom, Claude Rouillet has suggested that in fact a Nilo-Saharan language, obviously not specifically Nubian, but Nubian Meroitic are both extremely closely related. They're at least close cousins. And that there's not enough there to really characterize it in more detail, but he does plausibly, I think, argue that in fact Nilo-Saharan languages have been spoken at least from the period of the Old Kingdom, which I guess would be C group. A group, I don't know if you could say anything about.
Right.
And certainly early Kerma. In terms of the specific names that Egyptians are giving to people from specific localities. Within both Lower and Upper Nubia. Both Egyptian and Sudanese Nubia.
Kind of ironic too, because if we think of ancient Egypt, especially in the New Kingdom, they're an imperial power that is naming things and, imposing their names onto these regions. Some, we don't know if people in Lower Nubia call their country Wawat or, Taseti, maybe they did, but but in any case, I think it's more faithful, at least, to refer back to what either Egyptians call the region or indigenous people call that region and use that as the term, which I think Nubia does do justice to it.
I wonder, Deb, if that's at all what you had in mind when you said we needed to talk about terminology, or if there was something of your own you wanted to.
No, so I did want to talk about, and Shamarka has been talking about how we talk about the Sahara. So I think that the geographical terminology that we use, so we need to get rid of sub-Saharan, because that sub also has the implication of being subhuman. You know, that was a part of what went along with being sub-Saharan. So that terminology we need to rid ourselves of that terminology, sub-Saharan. We also need to think about how we talk about the Kushite pharaohs, because, you know, again, we've had these documentaries talking about the Black pharaohs. And we know that again, that's racializing. So in US race terms, as Stuart said, the opposite of Black is white. So if they're not the Black pharaohs, then they're the white pharaohs. And no, we don't do that, we're not racializing. So there's nothing wrong. Why can't we say the Kushite pharaohs, the pharaohs from Kush, the 25th dynasty? We know where they came from. So instead of saying the Black pharaohs, we could say the Kushite pharaohs.
Yes,
Kushite
absolutely.
dynasty, I should say, because we can't say, again, that pharaohs before that didn't have Nubian blood, because we know that some of them did. So again, we're talking about the Kushite dynasty being the 25th dynasty, and not the Black pharaohs, the Black dynasty. So that's one of the things that we need to talk about. And again, this is, in Shamarka, this is because you keep asking this, and I keep asking other groups, especially archaeologists, about this. So I'm going to raise it here, the term prehistory. Because every time I get into a group with other archaeologists, I said, okay, we use this term prehistory, we need to get away from it, but what do we replace it with? And so it becomes like this rhetorical question, because nobody has had an answer. But Shamarka, you've been raising this question. So if we have to, what do we use to replace the term prehistory?
Well, I didn't invent this. Chris Ehret and many of the Africanists, although their numbers are decreasing because they're dying, I mean, literally, they talked about early African history. So when you talk about when you use the phrase early African history, of course, they were mainly doing tropical African history, but they were talking about African history by which you needed to use archaeology and linguistics to reconstruct it. For Chris Ehret, when you look in the various volumes where he's written long histories, or even Pat Manning, some of these people, they'll use the term early history, you know, as opposed to prehistory, you know, and, you know, it's by saying early history, it forces you to think. And like I've said before, someone even like Collingwood, who wrote The Idea of History, British classicist and archaeologist, he said something a long time ago in his book. The Idea of History is a wonderful read if you've never read it. He says, you know, a potsherd or a pot can be a historical document. So he was trying to say that history isn't just this thing with text and what have you. And I think that we can do that. And in some departments, if I'm not mistaken, in Eastern Europe, you can tell me, Stuart, I think that archaeologists sit in the history department, right? They don't all sit in a separate, or they're not in the anthropology. They may actually be in the history departments, you know, in some places, in some traditions. So, you know, this is a matter about insisting on a different way of thinking. And I think that's very important, because otherwise you limit the notion of history to text and stuff to a certain period of time, which, you know, some people say, oh, well, that's an ego thing. You know, if you don't have lots of written records, then it's bothering people. No, it's because, as Geoffrey Lienhart once told me, he said, everybody's got a history, just as long as everybody else's. Just because you don't have all the details doesn't mean it didn't exist, you know. So, and that's absolutely true. And in fact, by talking about early history, it gives you a chance to explore different types of sources. And actually, if you think about it generationally, if you imagine the classroom of young kids somewhere and you say, oh, we're going to talk about early history, it's a wonderment, because, you know, if you start them off with the idea that there are all kinds of historical documents, not just text, then they come to everything with a different attitude. We're talking about paradigm shifting here on many levels. And I can tell you, what happened yesterday in the United States should make us all completely aware that things that are allegedly set in stone or set down in a particular way have no permanent meaning, and have no, you know, that things have to be enlarged to be thought about. Concepts like justice or what have you have to be enlarged, have to be thought about, and people have to insist on it. And so I think that, you know, when we do our different disciplines and stuff, we have to insist on the paradigm shift or different terminology or different way to talk about things, and let other people, you know, and let them figure it out. Let them figure it out.
I want to thank all of the panelists so much for your time and for sharing your thoughts with everyone today. And I want to thank the audience for your very thought-provoking questions. I had a wonderful time with everyone, and thank you all. Good night.
Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Vanessa.
Thank you.
Stuart and Deborah, Shamarka.
Yes, Stuart,
Absolute
Deborah, and
pleasure.
Evan, yes.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Really great discussion.
Conversation.
Very important.
Mm.